report of the President of Council, Mr. Tusk, regarding the extraordinary European Council meeting of the 23rd of April of this year. I would like to welcome Mr. Tusk, the President, and I give him the floor without further ado.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. President. Members of the European Parliament, last Thursday I called a special European Council to mobilize the European Union, its member states and its institutions in response to the dramatic situation in the central Mediterranean. We met 4 days after 800 people were lost at sea, and as you know, these were not the only casualties in the last weeks. Leaders were unanimous on the need to act concretely and rapidly. A challenge in the south is not only a challenge for southern Europe, but for the whole of Europe. And we have no illusions. We are facing a difficult summer ahead. Saving the lives of innocent people remains the priority. But this does not just include rescuing people at sea. It is also, in the short term, and maybe most importantly, about stopping the smugglers from putting thousands more lives at risk. It is about helping and engaging the migrants' home countries, the countries that they journey through, and those member states that face the greatest migratory pressure. Finally, we must step up our combined efforts to help people who need political asylum. Leaders agreed to action in 4 main areas. First, we will confront the smugglers and traffickers. The people smugglers in North Africa and elsewhere are cynical, callous and often violent. They take the life savings of the desperate and leave them to drown in the sea. Worse, they deliberately place vessels in dangerous situations. Leaders have asked the High Representative to propose actions, including a possible CSDP operation, to identify, capture and destroy the smugglers' vessels before they are used. We need to act in accordance with international law, and there are many aspects still to be worked out. Member States will also step up cooperation against smuggling networks by working through Europol and by deploying immigration officers to third countries. Second, we agreed to triple the financial resources available to our border operations in the Mediterranean, Triton and Poseidon, and to massively strengthen their operational capability. During the European Council, more than 20 leaders pledged significant support, including helicopters and surveillance planes, experts, patrol boats and naval vessels. In fact, all leaders expressed their readiness to help. This means that our operations will carry out their mandates faster and better and save more lives. Distinguished members, the best way to protect people from drowning is to ensure that they do not get on the boats in the first place. Almost none of the migrants are Libyans. Therefore, we will help the countries around Libya, Tunisia, Egypt, Sudan, Mali and Niger, among others, to monitor and control the land borders and travel routes. That means building on current CSDP operations in the region to help improve border management. It also means working more intensely within existing regional frameworks and with African partners on issues like development aid, anti-trafficking and refugee protection. Prime Minister Muscat has kindly offered to host a joint summit in Malta between the European Union and the key countries concerned. The final element was the need to do more on refugee protection. We all know that this is a difficult and sensitive debate. Still, we made some progress. This includes the full and effective implementation of the common European asylum system to ensure the same standards in all member states, an increase of emergency aid to frontline member states, and the deployment of support teams to help process asylum claims. Leaders also agreed to set up a first voluntary pilot project on resettlement across the EU and to look at mechanisms for emergency relocation within the Union. Dear members, leaders had no illusions last week that the current situation can be solved without stability and a working administration in Libya. We have a neighbour on our border without law and order, or a government with which to work. As long as that is the case, we must continue to respond to the situation and alleviate suffering wherever possible. The Commission, Council and the High Representative are finalising a roadmap that sets out precise actions, an exact timetable and clear responsibility for what leaders agreed last week. On this basis, leaders will come back to the issue in June to assess progress. Thank you.
Thank you very much to the President of Council. And now for the Commission, I call Mr. Juncker.
Herr Präsident, vielen Dank.
Thank you, Mr. President. President of the European Council, honourable members, the European Council's response to the human tragedy we've seen in the Mediterranean was instant but remains inadequate. I welcome the fact that my proposal on behalf of the Commission I welcome the fact that my proposal on behalf of the Commission to triple the funds set aside for Triton was taken up by Parliament and Council despite hesitation. Triton's funding is thus going to be beefed up to 120 million euro. That is precisely the extent of the Mare Nostrum budget. In other words, we're catching up, we're making up for the temporary cut which resulted from the end of Mare Nostrum and has cost human lives. Italy alone financed Mare Nostrum. Henceforth, it will be the European budget and all member states' national contributions that will fund Triton. In other words, that is a return to normality. It was anything but normal to leave the funding of Mare Nostrum to Italy alone.
Je lis parfois.
From time to time, I read that the Triton mandate is limited to search and rescue missions in the territorial waters of member states. That's frequently repeated, but it's wrong. The mandate is much broader. I'll spare you the detail, but there's no need to extend the mandate of the current mission. If anyone wanted Triton could intervene in international waters, and that is entirely normal. There's no need to extend the mandate. We simply need to ensure that the mission has the means at its disposal that it needs to intervene on the high seas. I said the European Council responded immediately, but that the response was not entirely adequate, and that is because the conclusions adopted at the Extraordinary Council were not as ambitious as they should have been, and I'd like to explain what I mean by that. It's one thing to tackle the symptoms of the crisis. As President Tusk has said, everything possible must be done to stop unfortunate people taking these awful boats. We have to be able to save human lives in the places from whence they come, to stop those same human lives ending on the high seas, and that means an increase in development aid. The European Council, as its president has just said, will have to take up the subjects that preoccupied us on Thursday. I shall work with Mr. Avramopoulos to set up a quota system. This is something I proposed at the last Council. We should have indicated our collective will to share refugees geographically across the EU. This is something that has to be done. It's not something that can wait.
On ne peut pas laisser aux seuls soins.
We cannot leave relocation of refugees to the member states on the periphery. This is all about shared solidarity.
Am Anfang, aber nicht Betroffenheitslyrik und Rhetorik auf Dauer.
It is very difficult to react, but we have to put forward a proposal that will guarantee that solidarity is shared. And we have to be sure that we deal with the tricky questions of legal migration. We have to leave the door partly ajar. If we don't open the door to legal migration, then the unfortunate people of the world will be climbing in through our windows. We cannot say that we can't be left to cope with all the poverty in the world. Legal migration is part of the medium-term solution and requires action on our part. I'm also aware, Mr. President, that we are frequently being called upon to act. People want the European Union to do everything it possibly can. But we have to be aware of fluctuations in public opinion. I have been calling for legal migration. More people are now calling for legal migration, but I wonder if they'll still be calling for legal migration in a few months' time when the subject is less fashionable. Everybody knows that the European continent can everybody knows that the European continent cannot be the only destination for poor people from across the world. People are escaping poverty, taking boats, and we have to make sure that they don't drown on our coasts.
Thank you very much to the President of the Commission. Now, on behalf of the EPP Group, I call the leader, Mr. Weber. President in Office of Council, President of the Commission, Commissioner Avramopoulos, doing an excellent job. Dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, we were in Italy last week. We had some discussions, and an Italian colleague spoke about the situation pertaining in refugee camps. We were told about a family who was there, who'd come from Eritrea. They set off with 5 children, but by the time they arrived in Italy, only one of the children was still with them. And he talked about the vacant look in the eyes of this man to whom he had spoken. Last year we were talking about 3,500 killed. This year already 1,600 who have died in the Mediterranean, already at this stage. It's a tragedy that moves us all, and it's an incentive for us to do something, to act. I would like to thank the President in Office of Council for taking the initiative, also making sure that we have now funding for search and rescue operations, and making sure that we have measures to deal with smugglers. These are the right steps in the right direction, and as the President of the Commission has just said, we're going to be continuing to work on this with ambition. In the EPP, there is one point that we're very concerned about, which is the distribution of the burden around Europe. At the moment, there is a handful of states who have to deal with the burden on their own, and that's why we're looking forward to the Commission's proposal in terms of burden sharing. A fair burden sharing system would have our support, sir. Secondly, colleagues, as concerns further developments, yes, we need to do more when it comes to stabilizing countries in Africa, in particular Africa. And if I may, I would like to make it clear to you that as Europeans, it's not just a matter of being self-critical. I think in some respects we could be proud. We should be proud. For instance, the last few years, the Commission has spent a lot of money, European money, in Somalia. We've started a stability initiative there, and thanks to that, we have stability, greater stability in Somalia, and fewer refugees coming from this country. So that too should be mentioned, the positive steps. And when we talk about Africa, I would like to express one wish. I mean, we're looking towards the Mediterranean, and we're saying, well, this is what Europe should do this, that and the other. Europe has failed. But as European politicians, yes, of course, we should be self-critical, that goes without saying, but we should also stand up and say quite clearly that the main failure is happening in Africa, not in Europe, because there you've got states, you've got politicians who are corrupt, who are not giving any prospects for hope for their peoples. That too needs to be mentioned. Now, colleagues, there are a couple of points where we're going to have heated debates. First of all, as far as Syrian refugees are concerned, yes, of course, we should welcome them. They are fleeing a civil war. But at the same time, we have an issue in terms of the fact that these people arrive onto the territory of Europe. They can't actually prove their refugee status. The processes are not the right ones. So we need to talk about that. We need to talk about third countries as well. To which ones can we send these people back swiftly? And also development aid. This is something that we need to negotiate, the Commission and the countries concerned. It's all very well sending development aid, but at the same time we would expect them to take back these people who cannot prove that they have refugee status, because if we're not able to refer these people back, to send them back, then it will be a failure for all of us. So this is something we need to be quite clear about. We know that 2/3 of the applicants actually have to be sent back. Another critical point that I would like to raise, if I may, legal migration. We agree that when you've got individual initiatives in Europe, if we can do something together, we all benefit from that. And I think it's good to set European targets and objectives. But colleagues, if you say that if you open up the door to legal migration, to our labour markets, that this would put an end to all the misery and destitution around the Mediterranean region, I'm afraid you are wrong. We're talking about maybe 500,000, maybe 1 million Africans. Are we going to welcome all of these people? If you're talking about quota, a lot of Africans will be looking for hope in Europe and will attempt that journey across the Mediterranean. So the legal migration is one thing. Mrs. Harms, I turn to you. You may shake your head, but I think that we need to have a debate here in Europe about this as well. Ladies and gentlemen, you have to remember that 1 out of every 5 young people in Europe, 1 out of 5, has no employment at the moment. These are young people without jobs. So, in all honesty, I would like to have a debate about that as well. You know, this is a social state of affairs. What can we do? What is the right approach? Is it the right approach to open our doors? I think it's a discussion we need to have, a debate we need to have. I think that there's certainly room for improvement, no question about that. But I'm not sure that a solution for illegal migration would be necessarily to have massive legal migration into Europe. Ladies and gentlemen, Europe is faced with a big task, a major task, and it seems to me that in our discussions over these next few weeks, this will all emerge quite clearly, will crystallize, we'll have various political debates, and I think we'll have a common approach as to what we want to do. I think we would agree in saying that it's a question of humanity, of Europe showing its humanitarian side, and I think that that is something that we certainly need to stand by, and we need to put an end to these deaths at sea. Thank you.
Herr Kollege Weber, es gibt eine...
Mr. Weber, Mr. UJHELYI would like to ask a question of you, Mr. Weber.
Thank you very much, Mr. Weber. What you just said, I'm sure, departed from a very valid point in the People's Party. There are a lot of people who agree, of course, with what you say. But let me ask you one question. Have you read recent news? One of the member states, in fact, leader of a political group that belongs to your political family, has the intention of acting here in Europe to actually go against our common European values. We're talking about 30 million euros that Mr. Viktor Orban would like to set aside at this point in time to raise certain questions that really have an impact on all the problems that we're trying to solve together. He's trying to destroy all of that work, all of those efforts. Have you spoken to Mr. Orban in the last few days about what's happening right now and his initiatives?
Mr. Weber.
Also auch ich möchte zunächst sagen, dass
Let me say first of all that I think national politics should be pursued in national parliaments. The left are always asking people to become involved, and now that a right-wing government is asking people questions, that's still wrong. I'm going to do the same as the President of Parliament. I'm going to speak to Mr. Orban. I'm not going to rely on press articles. But the fact is, when people are interested in the view of the people, that must be a good thing. Now, on behalf of the Socialists and Democrats, the leader, Mr. Pittella.
Thank you, President Schulz. The Union is based on indivisible rights, universal rights of human dignity, of freedom, of equality and of solidarity. That is the preamble to the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the European Union, a charter that is legally binding upon our institutions, but also morally binding. Hannah Arendt wrote that the right to have rights, or the right of every individual to belong to humanity, is something that should be guaranteed by humanity itself. The Parliament, through its resolution that it will be voting upon, I hope with an overwhelming majority today, I think is living up to its duties. It's refusing the logic of this being an emergency. It's not that we are indifferent to this, but it is excellent that we are united in our approach, because now is a time for us to be united and to show solidarity. We want binding mechanisms for burden sharing for asylum seekers, because it's unfair, as President Juncker said, for a few states to take 80% of asylum seekers. The next step for us in the Socialists and Democrats has to be for us to move on to ensuring that solidarity is efficient. The mandate of Triton needs to be clarified so that more human lives can be saved, and the 2001 directive on temporary protection must be implemented, which does provide for solidarity when there are inflows of migrants. All of the countries of the European Union should be giving emergency visas. Now, on the basis of that resolution, if I may so say, our institutions, the European Parliament, challenges the Member States and asks them to shoulder their responsibilities and face up to the fact that often they do not do this. President Juncker, you have been very helpful. I'd like to say that publicly and officially we support you and would encourage you along the path that you're following. President Tusk, over the last week, I think, has made some very positive points. We have an embryonic European migration policy, but we talk too much about security, too little about welcoming people. The Mediterranean isn't a border that can be made secure, and it's very difficult to protect this unless we have a long-term view on Africa. We won't be able to solve this issue. A child who is born in Africa today will live 30 years less than an equivalent European. Behind immigration, people are looking for a better life. I would say in conclusion that we're hearing about armed men who are terrorizing Burundi 10 years after the genocide between Tutsis and Hutus. But now, unlike the past, nobody can say, I didn't know. We do know, and yet we do very little. Today, with this vote, which transcends the differences between left and right, the European Parliament will be united and will show that it represents not just the people of Europe, but Europe's conscience. Thank you.
Meine Damen und Herren,
Ladies and gentlemen, the blue cards are raining down upon me, but I can only ever take one at a time. I just want to make that clear. Ms. Mussolini has a question to you, Mr. Pittella. Are you happy to receive? Mr. Pittella, will you field Ms. Mussolini's question? Over to you, madam.
Thank you, President. The fact that Pittella supports and agrees with Juncker is a little bit worrying. I would agree with what Weber said, but I do have a question. Do you think that we need to see as a priority that Dublin be changed? There's the point that when a migrant legally comes into the borders of the European Union state, that state becomes competent. Do you think that's where the problem lies, Mr. Pittella? That I agree with Mr. Juncker is nothing new. We in the S&D did in fact vote for President Juncker, and we have not regretted that. We do need to revise Dublin to show more solidarity. I think that's a fact that has become evident. We need to revise Dublin not so it becomes more restrictive, but to extend it. We can't leave it up to the countries that act as front office for migratory flows. Instead, we should be applying a principle based on solidarity.
Thank you. ECR Group next, Mr. Kamall.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. President. My parents went to Britain for a better life for them and their future children. And had they not taken that step, had they not left their homes, my life would be very different. So when I see poverty, or when I see tragedies like this, my heart wishes that we were able to offer that same opportunity to everyone. But my head tells me that we cannot. So to solve this crisis, there is no easy answer. To those who say that we should turn everyone away, or those who say that we should let everyone in, you are both wrong. So when I listen to the Council and the Commission, we have to ask ourselves, can we find a way for those fleeing persecution to seek asylum without having to make this perilous journey? And can we do this without creating massive camps on that side of the Mediterranean? I very much hope that the Commission and Council can address those particular questions. But those who seek asylum should be told quickly, if they meet the criteria, but that if they are unsuccessful, they should be returned quickly. And if they are offered refuge, will it be permanent, or will countries be able to ask them to return home when the reason for their asylum is no longer relevant? So last week's Council was really an important step forward. Help for rescue operations, targeting people traffickers who profit and prey on the misery of others, helping to alleviate the problems of those at the sharp end. But in reality, we won't solve this problem in the long term until we stabilise the region, and we all know that this will take time. But our member states must do all they can with the tools available to them: diplomacy, targeted aid and open trade. But we also need to seek to distinguish between economic migration and helping genuine asylum seekers. The asylum system must not be conflated with a migration system. Otherwise, we undermine public trust in both. Asylum must be about people running away for their lives, not for those who understandably want a better economic life. So seeking new forms of legal migration will not resolve this problem. People talk about the blue card system, but that is aimed at attracting skilled migrants, not people fleeing for their lives. Some speak of compulsory shared solidarity, but where is the talk of mutual trust that is sadly lacking between our member states? Let's not forget that 75% of asylum applications take place in 6 countries: Germany, Sweden, Italy, France, Hungary and the United Kingdom. And some of those countries are already facing pressures on legal migration. And let us not forget that tiny islands like Lampedusa see tens of thousands of people set sail for them. So if we want to stop these tragedies, we have to start answering difficult questions. Are we prepared to help process applicants swiftly and discourage people from making a journey? Are we prepared to target and take out the people traffickers? Are we prepared for those EU countries with little immigration to take more of those fleeing persecution, to reduce the pressure, to reduce the suffering, but to reduce the tragic scenes that we see on the borders of EU countries? Thank you.
Herr Kamall.
Mr. Kamall.
Question of Ms. Grapini. It's on the other side, surprisingly.
Mulțumesc mult, domnule președinte. Trebuie să
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Mr. Kamall, you have surprised me. You began with a personal remark about the origins of your family and how they arrived in England. Who is going to decide that such and such a group has a right to survive and another group does not? Who is to categorize people? Who is going to do the sorting? It seems to me utterly absurd to say we can send one lot back, we can bring another lot in on the basis of some bureaucratic conditions. Thank you.
Well, I was rather hoping for a question, but thank you very much for your speech. I have to say, I'm a little bit surprised by what you're saying, because my story is obviously a very personal story, but it was my parents seeking a better economic life. But here we are talking about people fleeing persecution. And part of the problem of this debate is that we are deliberately confusing legal migration and helping those in need. And we have to put an end to that deliberate confusion. And at the same time, we have to be quite clear, and I was quite clear in my speech. We should not shut our borders and let no one in and turn a blind eye, but neither should we go down the road that you propose, which is to let everyone in. We have to process applicants fairly and let in those who genuinely are seeking refuge on our shores. Thank you.
Now on behalf of the Liberals and Democrats, Ms. Intveld.
Chair, the images of hundreds of dead bodies floating in the Mediterranean is profoundly horrifying. But the most tragic aspect of this disaster is that it's avoidable. People have died unnecessarily. My group fully supports the joint resolution, and I'm glad that we send a very strong signal to the Commission and the Council in particular, who needs this message, I think. We welcome the swift convening of the Council, but the outcome of their meeting is totally inadequate, and it has been said here before. And we welcome the fact that the budget for rescue operations has been restored to the original levels and not tripled, as you say, but more funding is necessary, as well as the use of humanitarian visa. We must fight the ruthless criminals who get rich trading in human lives. Now, giving asylum to those who have fled war and persecution is a legal as well as a moral duty. This year alone, 2,000 people have drowned in the Mediterranean, but some politicians are shamelessly exploiting this tragedy for their own populist, xenophobic, anti-EU agenda. Some merely call for closing the borders. That's cheap rhetoric, not a solution. But some, like Mr. Farage here, is inventing scare stories about these operations, bringing in thousands of jihadis into Europe. But Mr. Farage knows full well that this is complete and utter nonsense, and that it's about as likely as thousands of Martians coming to Europe. But you aren't interested in the truth, you're only interested in getting elected. Now, the public consultation by Mr. Orban has already been mentioned. Mr. Orban as well is using this tragedy in the Mediterranean for his own populist purposes. And quite frankly, dear Mr. Weber, dear Mr. Brok, this is not about national politics. If anything, then this is about the European values that we stand for. And I hope that the EPP will finally decide to expel Mr. Orban. And incidentally, it's not media reports, it's on the government website. Now, Europe urgently needs policies for legal immigration. The reality is that our continent is rapidly shrinking as part of the world population. Europeans counted for approximately 20% of the world population in the 50s, whereas now we are a mere 7%. We need immigration in order to maintain our prosperity. Now, talking about legal migration is controversial and maybe not very popular, but that is what leadership is all about. It's not about finding the lowest common denominator or only taking easy and popular decisions. Leadership is about the courage to take tough decisions. And I welcome the words of Mr. Juncker, who is indeed showing leadership in this respect, and I would wish that the Council would do the same. And I hope Parliament will show that leadership today. Thank you.
Ja, meine Damen und Herren, ich habe auch wieder.
Ladies and gentlemen, a million blue cards again. You, sir.
You made an accusation that Mr. Farage has made up the allegations that tens of thousands of ISIS and terrorists will be coming to this European continent. Are you therefore saying that those people who have warned us about this, the United Nations, are you saying that the UK's own security services who have warned us about tens of thousands, and are you saying that the statements from ISIS themselves, who said that they're going to send tens of thousands, are all lies?
Most of the people that we're actually talking about, which we refer to as foreign fighters, are actually homegrown. They're EU citizens. And if anything, Europe has been exporting terrorists, jihadis traveling over there. And what we are talking about here today is rescuing people who are drowning in the Mediterranean because they are fleeing war and conflict, and exactly the people that you are talking about. And it has nothing to do with a flood of jihadis coming to Europe. And that is only invented by Mr. Farage to get himself elected on the 7th of May, Mr. Farage. And I think it is populist and despicable.
Das Wort hat jetzt.
I'd like now to.
The word despicable is thoroughly unparliamentary and should be withdrawn.
Inħoss li l-kelma despicable għandha tiġi rtirata.
So, Euer Lordschafft, sich das Wort zu ergreifen, ohne es erteilt zu.
Your Lordship, it's also rather unparliamentary to take the floor when you're not granted it. I'd now like to give the floor to Ms. Björk for the United Left.
My thoughts this morning go to all the ones that have lost their loved ones, their brothers, sisters, parents, their children. And my thoughts go also with admiration to all the ones outside this house that work every day to save lives, to bring people to safety. And we have today here Father Musi Serai, and I thank you for being with us here and for your tireless work to save fellow Eritreans fleeing the dictatorship there. Thank you for being with us. I think it's clear for everyone that now words are not enough, and ultimately, as said by earlier speakers, these responses to the catastrophes in the Mediterranean is about what kind of societies that we are building for the future. Are we going to put people against each other like the EPP just did, or are we going to have politics, economic, social and human rights ones that actually bring us into the future together? That's the choice we have to make. And that is why the Council conclusions, Mr. Tusk, are nothing less than shameful. Because they focus not on life-saving and opening this continent for people seeking refuge. They are instead focusing on keeping people away. Therefore, the responses of this House is extra important. And the resolution is in part taking on things that we as the left has brought forward for 10 years. Humanitarian visas and resettlement, and also increasing search and rescue. But they also, this resolution, have great lacks. We cannot accept that Frontex is being boosted when what we need is a Mare Nostrum. Other colleagues will speak to specific points on the resolutions, but it's clear that we as the left will continue to take a lead for a society that we build together and we do not put people against each other. Thank you.
Für die Fraktion der Grünen.
On behalf of the Greens now, Mr. Lambert.
Monsieur Tusk.
Mr. Tusk, who are you afraid of? Hundreds of thousands of men and women who've had to leave their homes. You or I would not do this, not happily so, but they're doing it to flee from war, from conflict, from the destruction of their lives. And you and your colleagues, heads of state and government, what you've decided to do is to dig your heels in. What I'm trying to say is, these 100,000 people, how can they be kept where they are? So keep them where they are so that we can then turn our gaze away and continue with business as usual. I'm sorry, but this is not a dignified way of proceeding. It's unworthy of Europe. Mr. Juncker said Europe is one of the richest continents in the world. By all means, wealth that is not well distributed, but we are rich nevertheless. And Europe often says it is the home of human rights. We are proud of that, and we always enjoy lecturing other continents around the world. So I would ask you please to listen to Mr. Juncker. He's one of yours, and encourage your colleagues to do the same. First and foremost, a genuine search and rescue operation program. To multiply by 3 a feeble budget is one thing, but what we need to do is strengthen Mare Nostrum, not give this job to Frontex. It's not their remit, but a proper search and rescue operation program that works and that has the resources. Also, of course, Europe needs to welcome refugees from these wars. Lebanon is actually receiving 25%, well, what is tantamount to 25% of its population as refugees from wars. It's almost untenable for them. Europe finds it hard to welcome just 1 refugee per every 1,000 inhabitants in Europe, and only a few member states, a handful of member states, are actually doing anything. We also expect the European Union to set up pathways for legal and safe migration. If you want to control a process, you should make it legal. That's the best way of doing it. Pushing it underground, making it illegal, is actually losing control completely. Now, in Europe, some politicians have decided to do scaremongering, relying on the fears of our population, particularly those who are most disadvantaged. And they're playing on this. They're playing on fear. They're saying the immigrant is a criminal, the immigrant is potentially a terrorist. Now, as far as we're concerned, that is irresponsible, and it is, again, unworthy of heads of state and government to actually support that discourse. Let me just remind you that all human beings are born free and equal in terms of their rights rights in terms of their dignity. Everyone has a right to life, a right to liberty, a right to the safety of his or her person. That is what the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And therefore, Mr. Tusk and heads of state and government, I would ask you to please rise to this challenge.
Das Wort hat jetzt für die
And now for the EFDD group, Mr. Farage.
Thank you. 4 years ago, I stood here and said that bombing Libya would be a huge mistake. But of course, the UK Parliament and this Parliament were desperate. There was a clamour to go to war. And so now we have a failed state of Libya, which is now a conduit being used for criminal trafficking gangs trying to bring people to Europe. We are guilty for this crisis. We are directly guilty for the drownings that are going on. And we are hypocrites in this place when we talk about poverty in Africa, when we pursue a common agricultural policy that puts barriers up to them selling us their agricultural produce, where we have a fisheries policy that rapes and pillages their seas and has caused environmental destruction, and we just assuage our consciences by giving away a bit of foreign aid. I am not blind to the human suffering that we've caused in many of these countries. I would call on this Parliament, this Commission, to end the barriers to trade, to stop the fisheries policy, to ask the United Nations to get involved and to try and help. But the real question we face is, what are we to do? Are we to go down the Australian system in dealing with this crisis? And indeed, the Australian Premier, Tony Abbott, has offered us his advice and help. Australia faced this. And Australia not only have stopped the boats from coming, they've stopped people from drowning. But no, we're not interested in what the Australians have done. We have decided that we can deal with this on our own. So we've decided that people can come and that people won't be sent back. Now, I suspect that it's a shock, and will be a hell of a shock, to many European citizens, including the British, to understand that we've already agreed a common European asylum system. And what today is about, and today's resolution, is the direct implementation of it. The problem, ladies and gentlemen, is this. The definitions for who qualifies for asylum are so wide, they include not just people coming from war, not just people coming from failed states. Mr Juncker this morning seemed to suggest that perhaps it would even include people who were fleeing poverty. I'm sorry, we simply can't accept countless millions. Already in countries like mine, 77% of the population say we cannot take immigration at current levels. But there is a real and genuine threat. When ISIS say they want to flood our continent with 500,000 Islamic extremists, they mean it. And there is nothing in this document that will stop those people from coming. Indeed, I fear we face a direct threat to our civilization if we allow large numbers of people from that war-torn region into Europe. It is ironic that 9 days before a British general election, Mr Cameron and Mr Miliband are not engaged in this debate, and in fact the UK can do nothing. We are impotent. We have surrendered our ability to get involved. I promise my party will stand up to this impending disaster for all concerned.
Herr Lamberts, Sie wollten eine Frage stellen.
Mr Lamberts, you wanted to ask a question.
The first time that we've had these kinds of exchanges, I'd just like to remind you that many terrorist attacks that your United Kingdom suffered from were actually acts of your nationals. Not imported terrorists, but people who were homegrown. So I'm not sure that any of your answers is an answer to that issue. Thank you.
I do accept, Mr Lamberts, that our failed policy of state-sponsored multiculturalism has led to a fifth column inside many of our countries. However, the number of those is mercifully small compared to the number of Islamic extremists committing the most bestial acts on a daily basis right across that region. This policy has no means and no way of filtering out extremists in favour of people fleeing in genuine fear of their lives, and as such we are making a massive mistake. Let us follow the example of Australia. Let us do everything we can to reverse the hypocrisy of groups like yours that have voted to make Africa poorer. Let us do those things. But if the message is that anybody that comes will be accepted, we are headed for disaster.
Herr Abgeordneter Faria, ich hatte den
Mr. Faria, what are you insulting me? What exactly are you gesturing?
Thank you very much. I had a question. I was just putting up my blue card and I wasn't given the floor. You gave the floor to my colleague, that's all. But what I wanted to ask Mr. Farage was whether Mr. Farage...
No, sit down. That's not the way it goes. I said at the beginning of the debate that there were thousands of requests for the floor, and I would only ever take a single blue card question, and you were by no means the first. None of that entitles you to insult the President of the House. The next speaker is Mr. Salvini, non-attached.
Thank you, President. I have heard a wave of hypocrisy and racism from the left. I am ashamed on their behalf. I've heard the same things that they said a year and a half ago after the deaths off Lampedusa. They didn't have the posters, let's help them, let's provide help. But since then, another 3,000 deaths in the Mediterranean. Just how many smugglers do we want to finance? How many deaths do we want to have in the Mediterranean? It's incredible that the President of the European Commission, the Commission that is pushing Europeans into poverty, says we have to open the doors to the house, otherwise people will come in through the windows. But who's paying you? Who pays your wage? Do you really think that 1 billion Africans should, in fact, come to a continent which has hundreds of thousands of unemployed people? I'm embarrassed by the level of this debate, which is attempting to find political guilty people who are sitting here. Now you realise that the Dublin Treaty has to be changed. You confirmed that 2 years ago. The Lega voted against it, and those who are waking up today voted in favour of this 2 years ago. Are we going to have to wait for another 600 deaths before we get more hypocrisy from the left?
Herr Salvini, da gibt es eine Frage.
Mr. Salvini, there is a question from our colleague Forenza. Are you prepared to take it? Yes? Mrs. Forenza.
Thank you. I'd like to say to Mr. Salvini that really, when it comes to racism, he's a master. And financing Mare Nostrum, do you agree it should be financed? Or that people who are fleeing war and poverty should die, either in the war or in the Mediterranean, which is what he would seem to be suggesting if we don't in fact save people in the Mediterranean. And I have to say that Mr. Salvini's words may not have been hypocritical, but they were disgusting nonetheless.
Mr. Salvini to answer.
You think that 1 billion African citizens can arrive in Europe and live in Europe? Do you really think that can happen? Do you actually believe what you're saying? Or do people pass you messages? I think Mare Nostrum was a racist operation financing Islamic terrorism and traffickers. I think the only way out is to finance these countries and so that the people don't try to escape from them. I was in Nigeria recently, which I think the left wing should do, visit these companies, because I think the European Union should be able to grow and people should be able to live where they are born. But that's not what we're seeing, and we're actually seeing ethnic cleansing, which is something we would oppose in any case.
Thank you. Next speaker, Mrs. HOHLMEIER for the EPP.
Gentlemen, presidents, colleagues, I think it's time for a serious debate. 50 million refugees constitute a problem that cannot be resolved overnight. We should not give the impression that there's an easy solution to the problem of 50 million refugees. We all have to do our bit. What does that mean, we have to do our bit? First of all, we have to save lives in the Mediterranean, but we also need to talk about the Sahara. We don't see the corpses there, but they're still there in the desert. That means we need an Africa policy that is actually implemented. Since 2007, we've had an Africa policy. In actual fact, we have 28, or is it 29, development assistance policies, which are uncoordinated in their approach to Africa. There is also responsibility to be borne there in African states for their African citizens. We also have to start combating human traffickers. I cannot accept the idea from the GUE that there's something wrong with taking international action against brutal criminals who murder and torture for profit. Those are organized criminals, those are terrorists, and we have to stamp them out. And then there's something else we have to talk about seriously, the subject of so-called legal migration. There are people who migrate for work, there are refugees, there is humanitarian migration. We have resettlement. We don't need new instruments, we need to use better the ones that we have. We can add new instruments if we think that there is a need for them, and we can do it in a coordinated way. But that's just a short-term patch. And we shouldn't be trading in short-term patches. It's populism.
Mrs. Hohlmeier, will you accept a blue card? Thank you. Blue card for Ms. Ernst, please.
Ja, vielen herzlichen Dank, Frau Hohlmeier.
Thank you very much. Mrs. Hohlmeier, I have quite a question for you, because you refer to smugglers and traffickers. What are the causes, do you think? How come these smugglers have this opportunity to transport so many refugees to Europe in this way? I mean, do you think we as Europeans are co-responsible? The fact that there is this business in smuggling?
Ich glaube nicht, dass die europäische
I don't think the European Union and its member states are responsible for traffickers on the African continent. The terrible civil wars, ethnic, religious and political conflicts that lead people to flee, that is what is permitting those criminal gangs to exploit people for profit.
Thank you. Our next speaker for 1.5 minutes is Madame Fajon.
Hvala lepa. Že dolgo vemo.
Thank you very much. We've known for some time now that a fairer burden sharing in terms of finances and staff, fairer burden sharing between EU member states is something that we need. We've talked about possible solutions for years, but unfortunately some states are being selfish, and because of that things are not moving ahead. I would like to speak about the possibility of setting up a fund for search and rescue operations. In our European budgets we have enough means, we just need to redistribute the money. We're talking about €791 that were introduced for smart borders. It's been set aside for that, and because of shortcoming in legislation we're not able to implement that particular program, and we won't need all this money. So why don't we use some of that money at least for search and rescue operations to help our European member states who are active in search and rescue operations, and also for merchant vessels. Operations such as Mare Nostrum, which could be funded. It's a question of political will, but that in itself is not enough. All states have to contribute financially and have to provide solutions for the refugees. a safe haven. So that is why I would like to talk about the introduction of quotas and safe channels of legal migration into Europe. The door to Europe must remain open, and Mr. Juncker, I think that is the right approach, and I would support you in this. We need to act collectively and immediately. If we don't do that, then I'm afraid our values will fall, and it will be very bad, not for us, and Africa will not be to blame.
Card from Mr. Borghezzi. Yes? A blue card? Please, for 30 seconds.
Thank you, Madam President. Mrs. Fajon was very specific, perhaps the first to be so, asking where we can find the resources to help refugees and those who deserve it. What I would suggest is that you ask Commissioner Juncker whether he actually intends to recover the billions of euros that multinationals didn't pay because they were his friends and he gave them favours. So if we recovered those billions from the multinationals, then we could use that money.
I'm sure the question was more directed to Mr. Juncker, but perhaps do you have any comment to make?
Jaz mislim, da gospod kolega to vprašanje v resnici ne namenja.
Thank you. Well, it seems to me that that question was not addressed to me by the colleague, but rather to the Commission. All I can say is that I support the intentions of the European Commission, their efforts, but European governments unfortunately have been selfish and have been silent. We have tangible ideas, we've been making proposals for years now, but unfortunately I fear that we're not ambitious enough, and yet people are dying in the Mediterranean. And therefore, yes, the establishment of a fund for search and rescue operations is a good idea, and we need the mechanism.
1.5 minutes. Thank you.
Dank u wel, voorzitter, beste collega's.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Colleagues, it's completely unacceptable for entire families to be drowned. And perhaps we should ask the question why the 28 member states of the European Union haven't come together to find solutions and create legal channels for migration and relocation. And I think the answer to that question is relatively simple, in that some member states often are afraid of these migratory flows. Some of the southern countries of the European Union and aren't genuinely applying the European asylum system. Today what we see is forced relocation, and it's becoming clear that there are immigrants arriving from the south who then move en masse to the north. I welcome the fact that the European Council has decided, and this is the first point on its action plan, to reinforce common security. Now, Mr. Juncker was suggesting that quotas are a possibility. Sweden, Belgium, UK do in fact already welcome large numbers of refugees. Now, would they pay the bill? Is that the kind of solidarity that you were imagining? As far as everything else goes, I welcome the fact that the European Union has the attention to be much firmer with traffickers, because they have, that's excellent, because they have the deaths of hundreds of people on their consciences, but we also need to combat violence and poverty in the countries people come from. And development isn't enough as long as corruption and violations of human rights continue. We have hundreds of people disappearing in Africa, and how can we tackle these problems?
Madam WIKSTRÖM.
Tack, fru talman.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Twice in succession, we have opened the plenary part session here in Strasbourg with a minute's silence to remember the many, many people who died at sea, who died in the Mediterranean. Last year we were talking about 3,500 people. Now that was a terrible figure. Unfortunately, that tragic figure will probably be exceeded this year, before the end of the year. So I ask you, gentlemen, how many people must drown before the Council understands that it's not a question of destroying the vessels that are transporting these refugees? That's not what it's about. What we need need is to build a system with legal, safe channels so that people can come to the European Union and seek asylum here. I think it's naive, and I think it's even cynical to say that all we need to do is destroy the vessels, to put an end to this terrible tragedy that is actually happening right in front of our eyes. Give asylum to people who are fleeing violations, war, conflict. It's not a matter of generosity, it is quite simply a duty, and all 28 member states of the European Union have stated that they are committed to this obligation in line with EU law and international law. The European Union has been successful in building a monetary union. We're also in the process of building an energy union. I ask you, when are we going to be building a humanitarian union? Now, stepping up Triton or other rescue operations, the funding available for that unfortunately will not put an end to these tragic events. What we need is safe and legal channels allowing people to come here. And I'm turning to the other side of the House, and I say to you, we need to have an overview of who's coming, where they're coming from, and of course that is important in terms of European security. I've heard your line of argument, but if we can do that, then I think we can also make sure that our asylum processes are predictable. And also this business model, the business models being used by unscrupulous traffickers, it would put an end to that business model. They're making a profit, we could put an end to it. Therefore, Madam Speaker, time is now not for words but for action. European solidarity must be raised to a new level, and by that I mean solidarity vis-à-vis those who are fleeing and solidarity between European member states and the European Union institutions. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
We have a blue card from Mrs. WINBERG. Will you accept blue card, Mrs. WIKSTRÖM? Yes.
Cecilia, you always talk about legal channels, and you always say that people should also be able to apply for a visa in situ. I have a question for you. 1 million people in Libya want to come to Europe immediately. How are you going to select the ones who will be allowed to come? How is this burden sharing going to happen? You haven't thought it through. It simply doesn't work. I'm all for the Australian model personally. Madam Speaker, well, that is typical. It's typical to get this kind of question. What I'm talking about is taking European responsibility. I'm talking about a European system to welcome these people. And let's start with the first thing that we can do tomorrow, namely to follow the Austrian example, the Austrian way of saving lives. All of the 28 member states of the European Union should accept a quota of refugees already defined in accordance with UNHCR standards. At the moment there are 15 countries who take on board some. 13 countries do precisely this. Nothing. And that is most upsetting indeed. Everyone should take responsibility.
Speaker for 1.5 minutes is Madam Spinelli.
Thank you, Madam President. I accuse Council, the government of the Member States, the Commission. You are directly responsible for the crime that is killing more and more migrants who are fleeing wars that Europe has encouraged and persecution that we tolerate. After the 19th of April, the Union too has been shipwrecked on denial and blindness. We declare war on traffickers and pretend to believe that they are the only people responsible for so many deaths. That is not the case. It is not them. They exist because there are no legal channels for access for refugees. You abolished Mare Nostrum, which did search and rescue operations on the high seas, and continue to finance Triton and Poseidon, whose priority mandate is to control borders, not search and rescue operations for people who have been shipwrecked. Thank you, Mr. Juncker, for your words, but the door isn't open. In a desire to shed yourself of your responsibilities. You went so far as to say, and I would quote the Commissioner, cooperation with dictatorships, Eritrea at the head, the worst in Africa. You violate legislation like the traffickers do, the law of the sea, the law of non-refoulement, and I would ask you whether we are actually in an undeclared war, not against traffickers, but against migrants. Thank you.
Will you take a blue card, Madame? Blue card? Excusez-moi. Madame Spinelli? Excuse me.
Yes.
Yes. Thank you. Mr. Udowski, you have the floor for 30 seconds.
Madam President, ladies and gentlemen, Ms. Spinelli accused Council of inaction. Council is an abstract institution. What does Ms. Spinelli ask of the Social Democratic government of Italy, which isn't an abstract institution?
Thank you for the question. I mentioned all the governments of the Union, and I was thinking primarily about the Social Democratic government, as you called it, in Italy, and the government that is most committed to sinking the vessels of the traffickers, thinking that migrants won't flee anyway and search out a different channel. If there's any policy and if people are guilty, I would say that the Italian government is the most guilty.
I now give the floor to Mrs. Keller for 1 minute, please.
Thank you. So last week, the heads of state of the European Union have met, and they were faced with the question of what to do in order to stop the dying in the Mediterranean. Mr. Tusk has explained what the priorities of the heads of state are: fighting smugglers with the military, and secondly, stopping refugees from even reaching the European shores. Is that really the answer of Europe, of the Nobel Peace winner European Union, to the drowning in the Mediterranean? You cannot be serious about that. Where is the humanitarian rescue mission that we need? Italy started it, the other member states refused and even said that helps smugglers. Where are the safe and legal access points for refugees, people in dire need of international protection? Where are the real answers from the heads of state? I think it is a disgrace what was decided at the Council. It was unfortunately a waste of time, even though it was a good point that you set together, but nothing came out of that. And by the way, dear colleagues from the EPP, President Juncker was your candidate, he is your Commission President, and you should listen to him more often. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker for 1.5 minutes is Madam Beghin.
Thank you. 800 deaths in the Mediterranean. That's an unimaginable figure. It's as though all of us, all of the MEPs, were to die on the same day, at the same time. And President Tusk, this is just one example, and it's only coincidence that it's not us at the bottom of the sea. We were fortunate enough to live on a continent that chose peace, whereas outside there's a war, a world of war. War which we have a great deal of responsibilities for. You and other heads of state met once again to decide to not resolve this issue. If Europe genuinely wanted to find a solution, then we could have a European Mare Nostrum, we could have humanitarian corridors, and we could apply instruments that already exist to Directive 2001/105, which obliges the member states to cooperate amongst themselves to transfer refugees from one country to another. But this mechanism exists, has done since 2001, and has never been activated. You, gentlemen, never activated it. You talk about solidarity, you mouth words of burden sharing, but continue to consider immigration as a problem that should be left to Spain, Italy or Greece to deal with, and Europe washes its hands.
Thank you, Madam. Will you take a blue card from Mrs. Costa? Madam? A blue card? Yeah, 30 seconds.
Thank you. I wanted to ask Mrs. Beghin, well, I very much appreciated what she said, but Parliament won't have a great deal of strength if the group is so divided that what you say, which I would agree with, is going to be denied by other colleagues in UKIP. We need to be very clear, I think, in our line of support for this resolution, which we very much hope will, in fact, receive support.
Io la ringrazio.
Thank you very much. Quite frankly, we may have some points that we don't agree upon, but in general, I do agree with what Mr. Farage said. We have major responsibilities. There are mechanisms that should be protected nonetheless, and I believe at this point in time we wouldn't have huge problems. The genuine problem is not us, it's you. You had all options of solving this problem, and yet I would imagine that in future we will have to be observing minutes of silence, because the only thing we can do is talk about nothing and do nothing and then have minutes of silence.
Mr. Papadakis, please.
We had bin Laden, we had the jihadis, and now the European Union has discovered traffickers. And that's just a fig leaf. Fig leaf because they want to implement new imperialistic attacks against people. You are responsible for these waves of migrants who massively drown in the Mediterranean. Traffickers are just the same system that you serve. Capitalism and migration, war and refugees, and all that for monopolies to make profits. However much the European Union tries to beautify the European Union as its policies, these European tears, which provocatively talks about smart borders, are just that, hypocritical tears. And what we want to do is to strike against capitalism and no longer apply Schengen or Dublin, and just offer real measures that will relieve migrants and refugees.
Will you accept a blue card? A blue card? Yes. And the blue card is for Mr. Federley. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Madam Speaker. It's striking, a full-blooded communist who doesn't speak about human dignity, not one word about it. You know, how are we going to turn things around? The Mediterranean is a dangerous area right now. How can it become an opportunity for those who are fleeing war? You know, this was a speech against capitalism. It was basically a speech also against human rights. This European Parliament should be bold enough to say, we have responsibility. We need to set up rules so that people don't lose their lives in the Mediterranean.
Do you have a response?
Human dignity will be judged on your policies. Policies that serve popular interests, migrants, refugees who abandon their homes. And there are specific responsibilities. We say that a migrant or a refugee has dignity when they have enough means to survive within the European Union and can overcome the problems they face at our borders. So we need more decisive and more determined steps. And I know our governments bear huge responsibility for this issue. And here we must underscore what the role of the European Union's role has been, what the role of Frontex has been, what the role of our repressive services have been, and then allocate responsibility.
For 2 minutes, please.
Gracias, señora presidenta. Los romanos.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. The Romans made 3 mistakes. They called foreigners barbarians, and they also paid foreign chiefs in order to prevent massive migration. They made other mistakes. Now, these are mistakes that we cannot afford to make. We cannot afford to treat people outside Europe in this way. We can't simply treat people on the other side of the Mediterranean like this, and we can't pay chieftains from other countries to stop people from coming to our continent. We have to understand the situation as it really is. We have to look at the real causes behind migration. Now, people traffickers, of course, bring immigrants here, But, you know, these people are paying, they're paying with their lives to get onto those rafts because they want to come. Why do they want to come? Because of war, because of fundamentalism, because they are being persecuted, religiously persecuted or politically persecuted. So we need to step up to the plate and save people at sea. So when a country refuses to have immigrants on its territory, what they're actually doing is multiplying the refusal of immigrants from countries where you've got people who are in illegal situations within their own territory. These people are being sent away, and the mafia are making the most of this. We must put an end to this. So, Madam Speaker, we have a discourse. Our discourse remains the same, disaster after disaster. There's no point in this if we do not do anything. We need to act. We unfortunately have dragged our heels for 30 years now. For 30 years ago, the immigrants were ourselves. How were we welcomed at the time? Let's not forget that.
Thank you. We have a blue card, Mr. González Pons. Will you accept a blue card? Yes. Okay. Madam Albion Guzman.
Gracias. Señor González Pons, me gustaría...
Thank you very much. I have two questions. Do you think that rescue missions should be like in Ceuta, with the security forces shooting on immigrants while they're at sea? Do you think asylum policy should be like Melilla, when we actually prevent people from asking for international protection?
Gracias, señoría.
Thank you very much. Well, Ceuta and Melilla are the only territorial borders that the EU has with Africa. Spain is under the obligation to defend those borders, and we must prevent any kind of injuries, damages for those who try to cross these fences, these walls. It can't be a no man's land between the border of Spain and the border of Morocco. And I should perhaps point out to you that only 3% of the people who cross this fence unlawfully in Ceuta and Melilla, only 3% actually apply for asylum. You have mafias, and they are trafficking people, and they are actually helping people cross the territorial border as well.
Now for 1.5 minutes, Madam Sippel.
Vielen Dank. Ja.
Thank you very much. Yes, indeed. We can't accept everybody who wants to come to Europe, but we could take in more if all member states were more committed to refugee policy and labour migration policy. With the latest tragedy off the coast of Libya, it's time for a sea change in EU migration policy, and Council has failed to deliver this signal. What is uncontroversial is that we have to deal with the problems in the source countries. We have to fight the trafficking gangs. But the higher our fences, the more dangerous the journey, the more of an incentive there is for the traffickers, the organized criminals. It is shameful that there are still member states who don't take in a single refugee as part of the reception program. That cannot go on. We need to share refugees across member states, and we need to use the measures we already have to allow refugees to live in our countries. We have to improve the labour migration system, because in many member states we need labour, and not just in universities but in other jobs too. It's time now for member states to act, and I call upon you, recognise the signs of the present time and act.
Thank you. We have many requests for a blue card. Will you accept one question, please? And I would say at this point we will have to limit blue cards because the debate will overrun, so I beg your forbearance on that issue. I now ask Mr. Glezos to put his question for 30 seconds, please.
I will agree with you totally. The basic reason has not been discussed yet here, because it's European countries who were colonists who have caused all these issues in their colonies from which these people come to us. But there is one country, Turkey, which is the one which sends most people to us and is the country which wants to become a member of the European Union. So what measures would you propose for that particular country?
That was a speech with a question perhaps at the end. I'm not sure if you caught the question within the 30 seconds, but you have the floor.
Ich denke, ich kann es ganz kurz machen.
Don't worry, Madam President, I'll be brief. It would be wrong in the present situation to wag a finger at a single country. What is happening affects all countries in Europe and around Europe. That's why I'm not going to answer a question regarding one single country.
Thank you. Our next speaker for 1.5 minutes is Mr. Kirkhope.
Presidents, Commissioners, Europe must act decisively. Every effort should be made to save lives, create stability in conflict regions and assist Member States overwhelmed by the challenges they face. But many in this Parliament believe the solution lies in more forms of legal migration and binding quotas. My group did not sign the joint resolution because such actions merely address the symptoms rather than causes. Member States need to commit more resources and offer more humanitarian resettlement and aid. We need efficient asylum processing and an expedient return system. Frontex, Europol and EASO need to be better equipped. Lives can be saved by not allowing trafficked vessels to depart in the first place and by cutting off the fortunes that are being made by human traffickers. This needs urgent cooperation with third countries to be achieved. True and meaningful solidarity is gained through trust, a moral imperative and a sense of responsibility which can never be created through compulsion. I would say to Mr Farage, who for the moment seems to have emigrated or sought asylum elsewhere in this country, of course it is wrong to confuse immigration and asylum, but to deliberately confuse immigration and terrorism is disgraceful and unacceptable.
Thank you. We have a blue card. Mrs. Ford.
Mr Kirkhope, thank you for reminding us that together we must work on helping the source of the problem. How important is international development aid? What more can we do to encourage Member States to live up to those vital Millennium Development Goals? And Mr Kirkhope, happy birthday.
Well, I can't answer that question very well, President. All over the world there are different approaches, of course. The Australia system was also referred, and it's an Australian system that suits Australia for migration. If Mr Farage, of course, likes Australia so much and its system, perhaps he should now move there. But frankly, ladies and gentlemen, as someone a little bit older today, I doubt very much whether Mr Farage would ever pass the points test set by the Australian government.
Thank you, Mr Kirkhope. We all join in the birthday greetings in the middle of a very tense and fraught debate. Laughter helps, but it doesn't cure our problems. So we continue with a very serious debate, and I give the floor now for 1 minute to Mr Michel.
First of all, I would congratulate President Juncker on his comments and the tone that he injected into it. I don't think anyone can doubt his sincerity. There is one point that I would like to make, though. Systematically, we hear again and again that the cause of this drama is primarily Europe. That's not the case. It's not Europe that's at the heart of this. It's actually the bad governance in countries of origin, firstly, and then traffickers, and then also, it's true, a lack of collegiate reactions or solidarity from all of the member state governments. And I must admit, I have a great deal of sympathy for Mr Juncker, who has to manage the huge egotism of some of the member states. Secondly, I do not believe that Fortress Europe is the solution. I think that we need legal channels that will regularly and humanely provide options for migrants. And finally, I had 1.5 minutes.
On my list, services, I have 1 minute, so it is 1 minute. So,
well, you should have told me.
Blue card question. Monsieur Michel.
Unfair. Just 1 point.
We do have a blue card. So could I ask you to take the blue card and perhaps you can use that opportunity? Oui, the blue card? Merci. Mr. Bonino, for 30 seconds. Bonanno.
Con tutto rispetto.
With all respect, I very much respect Ms. Bonino, but my name's different. Anyway, I have a question that I would put to you and to all colleagues. Hypocrisy. Who amongst you actually wants to take 3 illegal immigrants home with you and adopt them? And let's do that, shall we? And then see if you still think the same way.
Mr. Michel.
First of all, I do not really appreciate the way in which I was treated vis-à-vis speaking time. Secondly, I don't actually want to respond to such an outrageous question which expresses feelings which are relatively odious, and as such I do not see why I should answer that sordid question. I don't see how that would in fact contribute to the debate. I think it would just undermine the issue that we're debating. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Michel. We shall try and clarify the issue of speaking time, and we will come back to you on clarification of that. I will announce at this point, I have given a warning that we will take no more blue cards, and that is the ruling for now because the debate is quite tight on time. So I give the floor now to Madam Ernst for 1 minute, please.
Vielen Dank.
Thank you. I do wonder what's going on here. I think we're just spreading symbolic salt in a very real wound. We've got a number of ministers that have adopted a 10-point decision. They haven't consulted a parliament, not the European Parliament, not any European Parliament. You were not interested in the protests after the abolition of Mare Nostrum. Only when 1,200 people died in the Mediterranean did you take interest. And now you want to blame the smugglers. But the smugglers are a result of your policies, Mr. Tusk, Mr. Juncker. You are to blame. Just as those who turn a blind eye, who don't see the corpses, who don't want to look the victims in the eye. We call for respect for the victims. We want legal channels to Europe, help for the countries that are taking in refugees.
1 minute, Mrs. Lambert.
Okay, thank you, President. And I thoroughly agree with those who are saying we need to address the causes, but most doctors also look at symptoms. And safe routes are crucial for those fleeing persecution or who are at risk of serious harm. We should also remember that millions actually do stay in the region. Just ask the governments of Lebanon and Jordan, for example, and that those countries will need our long-term support. And I think some members in this House would do well to remember that in certain member states it would actually be a criminal offence to offer shelter to somebody in an irregular situation. And that's another situation we should be changing in terms of European law. The European Union can do more. We can use the common asylum system that we have much better. For example, the Dublin regulation does not mean that you have to return people to the country of entry. Member states can offer solidarity and deal with those claims in their own countries without return. So can we please use the system that we've got, make it more humanitarian, and actually stop letting people die at sea? Thank you.
Thank you. For 1 minute, Mrs. Wimberg.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Innumerable disasters in the Mediterranean, a tragedy a tragedy where thousands of people have died at sea, have lost their lives, and in all honesty, this situation has been created by the pull policy, the pull factor exercised by Sweden and Germany in particular, because when people choose to cross the Mediterranean to seek asylum and choose where to go, they don't choose Greece or Italy or Spain, they choose Germany or Sweden, and therefore Sweden and the Swedish government, with its irresponsible policy on immigration, really has a great responsibility for what is happening here. Now, the Sweden Democrats, we now of course have our own policy. We would like to support the 10-point plan that has been suggested by Mrs. Mogherini, and I would like to point out that we're not only supporting the 10 points, the 10 requirements, we also believe that this is very much in line with our discourse and with what we have been saying.
Madam, I now give the floor for 1 minute to Mr. Fontoulis.
Dear colleagues, hthес we discussed for thin plastic bags. Today we have to talk for some terrible bags that we use for the corpses of those who drowned in the Mediterranean trying to cross to Europe. Italy and Greece have to face a wave of illegal migrants that you invite, telling them that Europe must open its arms and welcome them. Europe, together with the United States, are those responsible for the reasons, and not all illegal immigrants are from Syria and Libya. Our islands are full of people who throw away their travel documents. They don't want their data to be known, because that would mean that they would have to stay in Italy and Greece. If Europe needs them, let Europe give them travel documents so that they can travel to other countries. Those who do not fulfill the criteria should go back. Greece cannot bear any more to be the wave breaker for those waves. We must fight the smugglers in Turkey and Libya, protect our borders. We must find a solution right now. Thank you.
Madam Mazzola, 1.5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. We need to go beyond political slogans. We can send an important message from this Parliament today, and so we should. We need more resources, more search and rescue resources in the Mediterranean. The 10-point plan of the Commission and the European Council conclusions are a step forward. However, there is much more that we need to do. We must make sure that these commitments are honoured and that these assets are best used to save lives. We must establish a clear mandate for Triton to expand its area and ensure that its mandate for search and rescue is done. We have to fight these traffickers, and also we welcome any action taken in this regard. We also need to send a strong message to Member States that it is time for solidarity and a new binding mechanism, and we also have to see what each member state can offer. This is not the issue of Malta, Italy or Greece. It is an issue of each single member state. The answer is not a fortress Europe. We need a response that is based on solidarity. We also need to examine the issue of humanitarian visas, and we also need to address the problem of those who really need our help. And therefore, we need to look at the return of those who are not eligible for protection in Europe. The point is that immigration and asylum deserve a better European response that is better and fairer. Let's make sure that this happens. Thank you.
Thank you. For 1.5 minutes, Mr. Boncinaro.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. In this House, in our institutions, too many times we have expressed our sorrow for stories that keep happening again and again and again without concrete solutions being adopted. You cannot wait until the next tragedy. We must act now and must concretely. I am happy that an extraordinary council was called, as well as a Foreign Affairs and Home Affairs Council, but I am less happy with the outcome. Between the Council outcome and between the position of the President of the European Commission, Jean-Claude Juncker, with no hesitations, I welcome the position of President Juncker, and this is the European way to act. Is the time Europe to deserve its Nobel Prize and to act with full strategic and common vision and understanding of the complexity of the problem. Number one, Triton must be widened and enhanced to meet at least the features of the Italian Mare Nostrum. Number two, the responsibility towards the refugees and asylum seekers should be shared among all member states. Number three, in the short term, Europe should make sure that such a crossing of the Mediterranean organised by unscrupulous human smugglers are stopped and the criminals brought to justice. But it's obvious that the real problem lies in the crisis these people escape from, starting from the conflict in Syria with the division and the failing state in Libya, the poverty and the conflicts in the Sahel region. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Now for 1 minute, Mr. Hall-Aho.
Thank you, President. Search and rescue operations are not a long-term solution, as they only encourage more people to take the sea journey and thereby lead to new tragedies. Many people in the Parliament call for resettlement and new legal channels to Europe. This is not a solution either. Europe cannot afford economically, socially or politically this kind of immigration in this kind of numbers. The vast majority of refugees will in any case remain in conflict zones and refugee camps, often in miserable conditions. This is where we should use our limited humanitarian resources, not on rescue operations or the few lucky ones who have the money to pay the smugglers. In short, it is in our own interests and in the interest of the vast majority of refugees that we stop thinking about ways to bring people to Europe and start thinking about how to help as many people as possible where they are. Thank you.
Thank you. Now for 1 minute, Mr. Arthuis.
L'opinion publique s'interroge.
Public opinion is asking, what is Europe doing vis-à-vis these migratory flows from the Middle East and from Africa, this influx? We have held minutes of silence repeatedly. We have seen repeated tragedies on the Mediterranean. Basically, it is an indictment because we are unable to act. We look towards Frontex, the European Union's agency that is to cooperate together with member states to control our borders and make sure that there's no illegal crossing of our borders. Frontex has been working now from Warsaw for about 12 years. The staff members are not all Polish. The host country is Poland, and for all staff members who come from outside of Poland to work there, benefits are provided. That is part of the headquarters agreement of Frontex. Now, I understand that Poland has still not signed this headquarters agreement, and I'm surprised, and I would therefore turn to the President of Council, asking him to please make sure that the Polish authorities meet their obligations vis-à-vis these staff members. Otherwise, how can we possibly control these migratory flows? Thank you.
Thank you. For 1 minute, Madam Albiol Guzman.
Gracias.
Thank you. There's no doubt we're being governed by a band of hypocrites, because it's indecent that those that are responsible for having converted the Mediterranean into a common grave are now going to public opinion and saying how sad they are about the deaths. Let's be quite clear. Your foreign policy, economic policy and border defence policies are incompatible with rescuing those who are risking their lives at sea. Not only are they incompatible, they're actually the cause of these deaths. First of all, we bomb Libya or Syria, which have natural resources, such as the Republic of Congo as well. Then they pay Tunisia or Egypt so that people fleeing don't reach the sea. They can die, but not in the Mediterranean, because we don't want to see them die in Europe. And then, if they do manage to reach the continent, they are sent back to poverty, hunger and bombs by plane. Also that the Moroccan kingdom can do our dirty work. So we should stop being so hypocritical.
Thank you. For 1 minute, Madame Joly.
Madame la Présidente,
Madam President, the proposals from Council are unworthy and fail to do the necessary. The proposed solution is not going to work and people are going to die. We're simply allowing mafia organizations to feed on our inaction. We are politically bankrupt and we're facing a humanitarian catastrophe. We need international solidarity and wide-ranging search and rescue operations. Once upon a time, we took in hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese boat people. We need to do much more than accept merely 5,000 refugees. We need to allow refugees legal routes in. We should not close our eyes to the corpses lining the Mediterranean seabed. There is no excuse. We ourselves have failed.
For 1 minute, Madame Ferreira.
Grazie Presidente.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Colleagues, the West has in fact defended its interests through military interventions and has destabilized whole regions, including Northern Africa. And now we're looking for solutions to problems we're partly responsible for. I do wonder whether tripling the Triton budget or destroying traffickers' vessels is the proper response to a humanitarian crisis. There's a great deal of disappointment amongst the public. The conclusions of the summit of the 23rd of April did suggest shameful, inadequate, insufficient measures. We feel that it's of vital importance that we act immediately to institute a European Mare Nostrum, a search and rescue mission. This is something that needs to be included in the mandate for international waters, and a military solution is not the proper one. Instead, we should have an overall approach which will also tackle root causes as well as the safety of refugees and immigrants and ensure that they have legal channels of immigration open to them. I hope that these words aren't hypocritical and that Europe really will start suggesting common sense solutions.
Buongiorno a tutti.
Thank you, Mrs. Ferrara. Good morning to everybody. I'd like to pass the floor to Mrs. Le Pen. 1 minute.
Well, the truth is, it's your migratory policy that has generated these tragedies. The Italian Marine is being told to get the boats in. You're talking about multiplying the budget by 3, bringing these migrants to European shores rather than leaving them there. Quite frankly, we are playing with the smugglers here, with the traffickers. It is basically being complicit, providing help, providing means. Also, when it comes to the expulsion of illegal migrants, you have limited the possibilities for that. To put an end to this tragedy and to illegal immigration, we need to make sure that member states have the possibility of having proactive policies to put an end to the pull factor, to bring these ships back to the port from which they departed. That is the kind of policy that we need, and we know that the Australian example is a good one to follow because it is successful and effective. Also, of course, we need to look at the countries of origin. In a way, your governments are responsible for the fact that these regimes are thriving. Let us stop being hypocritical. Mr. Juncker has said you need to open the door to stop people coming in through the windows. I mean, you listen to that, but quite honestly, have you asked the people of European nations what they think about this? You know, for 1 hour now we've been talking about this issue, but we haven't talked about the people of Europe. I'm not surprised.
The presidency has decided that we're not accepting blue cards because we're so behind in the debate. Mr. Lavia, 1.5 minutes. President, I come from Sicily, a border region which obviously is subjected to a great deal of migratory pressure. And every morning in the ports in Sicily, my Sicily, I see the faces of these immigrants who are arriving and who quite evidently are their faces show the crossing they've made, difficult crossings through the deserts, arriving at the coast, and then an even more difficult crossing to Europe. It's unthinkable for Europe not to provide an unequivocal response. After the tragedy, we've finally seen Council act as the Europe that we want. Maybe we're starting to understand that this isn't just an Italian problem, it's not a Greek problem, a Spanish or a Maltese problem, it's a problem affecting the whole of Europe. We probably should do more. We must do more. We can't think that revising the Dublin regulation or CFSP in Syria and Libya, or an agreement on obligatory quotas for refugees, reorganizing the system for asylum seekers recognition, which requires cooperation between all the member states, and reinforcing Frontex. All of these are just steps. But the most difficult issue that we have to tackle is the question of the source countries, development aid, making efforts to ensure that source countries grow and experience genuine economic growth. That's the path we should be following, including as well bringing peace to areas in conflict. That's the kind of Europe that we are committed to and want to see.
Per un minuto.
Thank you. Toya, 1 minute. Thank you to Mr. Juncker. We are comforted by your determination and also the efforts of Mrs. Mogherini. What we're seeing are the conflicts in the Middle East and Africa having an effect. Once again, the history of Europe is crossing with that of the southern Mediterranean, and Europe has to take that into account. We won't get through this by burying our heads in the sand or looking to the east or the Atlantic. Europe needs to have a strong voice in the world, and will only have that if we can speak with a single voice close to home and shoulder our responsibilities at our borders and within our borders too. We need to respect our values, which have been put to the test by this situation. We are losing lives. Civilization calls on us to save these lives, and we must do so. We have a common responsibility, and we should use that in the 10-point plan, and the Council should use this to develop an effective policy for this emergency, saving human lives and guaranteeing human corridors, and also ensuring that countries of transit, source countries, also are involved in the solution.
Mr.
Tomasic, 1 minute.
Thank you. Sunken ships and thousands of dead in the Mediterranean are a warning to us all. Perhaps we cannot resolve the suffering of all the world, but we can do much more to prevent such things from happening again. First and foremost, we need a better approach to the problem. Unfortunately, many perceive this as a platform for gaining political points. Things are very simple. There is not enough room in Europe for all the poor and unfortunate people of the world, but we cannot allow them to die at our doorstep. This is why we need to tackle root causes in Africa. The European Union is the biggest donor in third countries. This money must be channeled into fighting against trafficking in human beings, establishing better cooperation with institutions of the African countries, putting in place the rule of law, and improving social and economic conditions in these countries. I'm convinced that no one wants to leave their home. They will do it only if they are forced to. Let us help create conditions and enable them to stay.
Thank you.
Благодаря, господин. Дневните трагедии в Средиземно море са изпитания за всички нас.
The tragedies in the Mediterranean Sea constitute a huge challenge. People fleeing terror and persecution are dying, are drowning, and we need to take a common approach. We have to beef up the operations to save people, but save lives, but we also need to ensure burden sharing across the member states. A few member states are bearing a disproportionately large share of the burden, and thus the European Commission and member states must shoulder proper responsibility. We need criteria for the sharing of refugees.
The issue of immigration has never been dealt with in its true dimensions by the European Union. It's never been seen as a common problem for Europe. These repeated sinking of ships and nautical tragedies in Europe do make us shed the occasional tear, but in the end nothing changes. The European Union leaves practically unsupported the member states from which the migrants arrive on our shores, Malta, Italy, Greece, and their final destination, which is in the north of Europe, will not assume the responsibilities, even financially speaking. The 10 points of the action plan, which have been recently published by the Commission and the Council, are a late and rather restrictive response, which trying to put out the fire of migration. We'll never be able to deal with migratory flows unless we help them improve the situation in countries such as Syria and Libya, because the unreasonable interventions of European and other countries has caused chaos. So we should stand forewarned and act with more caution.
Gracias, señor presidente.
In this debate, the only thing that I would like to highlight is that the money and the means set aside by Council recently are based on good intentions and may save some lives, but let's not forget that here in the European Union we don't really have a genuine immigration and asylum policy. It's not true that we have a bad policy. What we actually have is a non-existent policy. That is the serious problem. We don't have a common asylum and migration policy, I'm afraid. So aid is being provided, but behind that there is powerlessness, and there are immigrants who are risking their lives, who are leaving their countries of origin. Unfortunately, the problem is not being resolved. In a way, these measures will just postpone the problem. What we need is a strategy for the Mediterranean. We need to help the countries of origin. We need to have a common policy to welcome these refugees, to provide asylum. If we fail to do that, then thousands of people will lose their lives in the Mediterranean. We can't allow ourselves to do this. We can't afford to do this. It's our duty, our obligation in moral terms to act.
Mr. Belinsky, 1 minute.
Danke sehr, Herr.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. President. Two things, ladies and gentlemen. Anyone who needs shelter and protection must be granted it. Secondly, anybody in distress at sea must be helped. That's clear. The political question is different, however. How do we go about helping these people, and where? Why should people travel halfway round the earth to knock at Europe's door? For years there have been much better proposals. In 2005, German Interior Minister Schily proposed an agreement with the African countries. Last year, the German Interior Minister proposed a reception centre in North Africa, and I think that's where the European Union is guilty of inaction. It's time to act. It's time to act with countries like Morocco, Egypt, Tunisia. Ensure UNHCR standards in refugee reception centres there to keep people in the region so they don't take that dangerous journey across the Mediterranean.
Thank you, Mr. Walensky. Unfortunately, I am in fact forced to remind people to stick to their speaking times because we have a very long list of speakers still, and I don't actually know whether we'll be able to get through everybody, and then we've got a very long voting list as well today. Mr. Brok, 1.5 minutes.
President of Council, Vice President, colleagues. The European Council took an important step in the right direction. We're talking about human lives above all. And anything else that we discuss here, we have to make it quite clear this is not negotiable. Human lives must be saved. Second point, we need to recall that some people are saying that in the Sahara region there are as many people dying as in the Mediterranean region on their way from sub-Saharan Africa and elsewhere. That too needs to be borne in mind. Now, we need to look at our development policy, our foreign policy. We have a failed state, Libya. We need to do something about this. We need better governance in the countries of Africa. We need to also look at Eritrea, what the authorities there are doing vis-à-vis their very own population. All of these issues need to be addressed if we are to improve the situation. The trafficking. Our news agencies get a lot of information, but I don't understand. I don't understand how come they can't come up with any answers as to how we can deal with the traffickers to stop people taking these risky journeys. So that's important, and in addition to that, I would be in favor of quotas, settled quotas, so that we can have a distribution, so that nobody can retract. We don't want to give an opportunity to populists to use this as political ammunition. And Mrs. In 't Veld, I turn to you. When you speak about Hungary being the country that actually took on the most asylum applicants after whatever it was, Sweden or Germany, I think it's not acceptable for us to say such things in the chamber. Let's be honest about what's really happening, and let's have a quota system, because a quota system is clear and nobody can retract.
Thank you, Mr. Brock. Mrs. Garcia Perez, 1 minute. Thank you very much, President. The tragedy in the Mediterranean has caused pain and indignation amongst many European citizens. This isn't the time for empty rhetoric. Council's response has been inadequate when faced with a problem that required responsibility, reaction, leadership and commitment. This requires a joined-up approach with cooperation policies, making it possible to stabilize this area of the world, opening up dialogue on asylum policy, extending the mandate of European search and rescue missions, because what we're talking about here are men, women and children who are fleeing from misery, from terror, from fear, from war. They're fleeing from a death foretold. And in the meantime, some political leaders have been mentioning the fact that saving lives could have a cascade effect. Is it that they have no heart? And if they do have no heart, surely they shouldn't be responsible for governing others. Thank you. Mr. Hadjigeorgiou, 1 minute.
Greece is flooded by a mass influx of migrants because of the conflicts in northern Africa and Syria. Our Coast Guard says that in the first quarter of 2015 we had 10,715 people coming in, and the same figure for 2014 was around 2,000. The wave of illegal immigration has crashed against the shores of the European South, suffering from austerity and unable to deal with the huge migratory flows. Greece has been made poor by the memoranda and cannot take in any more illegal immigrants or refugees. We have to scrap the regulation of 2013, which has made us a parking lot for lost souls. European solidarity, what does that mean? An allocation of the burden of these flows, a fair allocation amongst the countries of the European Union, depending on GDP size and also unemployment rates. The recent European summit once again put the ball back into our court. Greece, Spain, Italy, Malta, and that's unacceptable.
Thank you very much. Mr. Hadjigeorgiou, 1 minute.
I don't think I need to repeat that to solve this problem. First of all, we should try and seek out its causes. And the basic cause is wars. Nobody leaves their home and risks their life unless their life is in danger or if he's dying from hunger. So we should stop these wars. How can we do that? This Europe is the executive arm of the warlike policies of the US. Europe must become a factor for peace, an autonomous factor for world peace. There are some good ideas to face up to the consequences of war. We should have intermediate transit reception camps in countries with relative stability, like Egypt, for example. There, quickly and with transparency, we should examine their claims for asylum, and then the member states should accept their responsibilities according to their population. Gentlemen of the Commission, the fish are feeding on the corpses of the people in the Mediterranean, of the drowned people. Is there any way to explain such shame?
Panie Przewodniczący, Szanowni...
Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, history can teach us a great deal. We only need to remember a few generations back. People were emigrating from here, and they were crossing a much bigger pond. They were crossing an ocean, and they built a new life from nothing, and they've built the most prosperous country in the world, the most powerful country in the world. It was possible, it happened. We can learn from that. There are just two reasons why that happened. They were able to be sure that over there they could work for themselves and nobody could take the fruits of their labor away. They were able to build prosperity. On the basis of those principles, we should allow immigrants in and let them build prosperity here. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Coelho. 1.5 minutes. Thank you very much, President. Colleagues, there are two facts that we can't ignore. The first is that we do not have, and we must have, genuine European asylum and immigration policies, which will be effective and which will demonstrate solidarity. The second is that we're confronted with a humanitarian emergency. More than ever, saving lives should be a priority. If nothing is done, and if the trend is maintained, by the end of 2015 there'll be more than 9,000 deaths. Mr. Donald Tusk, there's no diplomatic way of saying this. On these two areas, apart from desultory measures, Council has failed. There's no sign of European asylum and immigration policies, and the humanitarian emergency hasn't been properly tackled. This intention of tripling the budget of Triton is being reported in the media, but we know what it actually means. It means that in the European Union, 28 member states are coughing up as much as one single country, Italy, did with its Mare Nostrum operation. I would call on Commission and Council to assure Parliament that Regulation 656 of 2014, which we adopted last year, is being genuinely applied, which seems unclear as a result of declarations being made by spokespeople from Frontex. Contrary to what some people said, what we need is more Europe, more solidarity, and I will be keeping a very close eye on the agenda of the Committee on Migration. It is time to act. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Leichtfried. 1 minute.
Thank you very much, President. It seems to me that there are a number of things that we need to talk about quite clearly. First of all, people whose lives are at risk. You have to do whatever you can, whatever is feasible to save these people. There's absolutely no exception to that rule. Secondly, fair distribution. Yes, we've talked about quotas. Maybe quotas are the solution that we require in order to make sure that there's a fair distribution of refugees in Europe. And thirdly, the third point is legal migration. We need to have legal migration, legal immigration. I think that with these three measures we can do a lot. But of course, none of this will be effective if we don't have additional measures to stop people from being forced to flee. We need to have a sound trade policy, a sound foreign policy, an economic policy that doesn't allow our companies to simply exploit the raw materials in Africa, for instance, unfairly. It's all very well having a discourse, but we need more. I have a comment from Mr. Kirkhope as well.
And Mr. Farage to Australia.
he tends to be one of these guys who mixes up everything and finally he lands in Austria, and we don't really want him. Thanks very much.
Grazie. Thank you very much. Mr. de Graaff, 1 minute.
Voorzitter, met tienduizenden komen jonge mannen uit Afrika en het Midden-Oosten via...
Tens of thousands of young people are coming from Africa and the Middle East to Europe on rickety boats, lured by the prospect of free money offered by the socialists. We're talking about people who can't read and write. It would be better if they stayed where they came from. The EU doesn't need parasites, it needs people with skills. We don't want people here who just want to take and not to give. Australia has done the right thing. There are no more deaths at sea. It's time to destroy those boats, even if we have to do it in Libya.
Thank you. Mr. Diaz de Mera, 1.5 minutes. Thank you very much, President. Why are we here? We're here because of these deaths who have a duty upon us. This is an emergency debate, therefore, and there are 3 priorities for this emergency. First, search and rescue missions, saving lives. But with Frontex, I'm not convinced. Frontex is getting more money and more competencies, and Triton has now been scaled up. But is that going to solve the problem? No. If people leave Africa, either they die or they're rescued, and Frontex or Triton won't stop that. Second priority is to neutralize the organized criminal gangs in their operational bases, either with or without a mandate from the UN. Libya. We need to, in fact, ensure that we have smart corridors, human chains, and that we are in dialogue with Libya. And we also need to ensure justice. The third priority is asylum. Asylum is a vital obligation for Europeans. It's a moral obligation for Europeans. It's a legal obligation for Europeans. Article 118 of the TFEU does say that. We need to read that. And how do we manage asylum? With solidarity. That's a contradiction in terms, but it is the solution. Obliged, mandatory solidarity. That's all. Thank you. Thank you very much. Kienge for 1 minute.
Grazie, signor Presidente.
Thank you very much, President. We have to ensure member states shoulder their responsibilities and move out of their impasse. And let's look at these people who are fleeing war in Syria and in Libya from Boko Haram and Ashdab. We have to have the courage to have a migratory policy that reflects the founding values of Europe and the primacy of human life. I would also call on the governments of Africa, who are passively accepting evil and are as responsible as those committing it. We need an overall approach towards this. Only if we have consistent policies in the short, medium and long term, that's the only possibility of managing this unstoppable and continuous flow. Now we're experiencing an emergency with thousands of deaths at sea. We do need a European Mare Nostrum. Tripling the resources of Triton is positive but insufficient, and particularly with the lack of a clear mandate to save human lives and extending its mandate operationally. We have to give hope to those who are arriving on our shores. Thank you very much. Steer, 1.5 minutes.
President, the latest
external and development policies on building inclusive and effective institutions in countries that are today in complete chaos or ruled by corrupted elites, which bring such misery to their citizens that many of them prefer to risk their lives on a boat than staying in their oppressed homelands. These desperate people are ready to give their life savings, sometimes up to €10,000, to smugglers, traffickers, in exchange of a promise to reach the shores of Europe. Imagine what a win-win situation would be to allow these people to invest this money in their own countries, to start a business and build a new future for their families. Yet they cannot do it because they are almost certain that there is no future for them in their countries torn by corruption and violence. This is exactly why we need to refocus our external and development policies on combating corruption, fostering the rule of law and good governance, promoting peace and security, and confronting when necessary corrupted and oppressive regimes. And I say this based on my own family experience as a grandchild of migrants. In the late 40s, my grandmother escaped from communist Yugoslavia, and while she was thankful for reaching the free world, she became really happy only when her homeland was finally freed from oppression. And eventually we came back to Croatia. I am sure that this quest for freedom is universal and that the EU has a moral obligation and a strategic interest to avoid more tragedies in the Mediterranean by promoting peace, security and the rule of law in a more firm and assertive way in the countries of origin. This should be the priority for our external and development cooperation policies. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Moraes, 1 minute.
Mr Farage and Marine Le Pen like to have a poster boy of Australia. Let's be very clear. Last year, Australia, and every year, Australia admits 200,000 legal migrants, 13,750 settled refugees. This illustrates a very clear and simple fact that this is a complex issue and there are no simple populist solutions. No simple populist solutions, and the Commission came here today with a plan, and I hear from my colleagues that they understand that Tritron and the way that we have heard from the Council that we don't have the adequate solutions. We got inadequacy from the Council last week, but we had a plan today from many of my colleagues. We understand the humanitarian imperatives, and we understand that we have to save lives. But we also understand that we have complex solutions of resettlement, we have responsibility sharing, and we are not all in this together. If we ask a month from now whether Malta or whether Italy has a real plan that has worked, will the answer be yes? It will not be yes, because the Council were dragged kicking and screaming to this meeting. They didn't give us the action we needed. We are hearing it now today from most members who believe in the values of the European Union. Let's ensure that the majority here who spoke today have their way, and with the Commission we get the plan that we need.
Thank you, Mr. Moraes. Ms. Kukrytska, 1 minute.
Tragedia na Morzu Śródziemnym.
The Mediterranean tragedy required quick action, and quick action was taken. The conclusions of the Extraordinary Council Summit and the Commission's action were designed to save the lives of people whose dream was to reach Europe. The decision concerning Triton was important in the light of the tragedy because it is needed to save lives. However, what is needed is to ensure that Frontex can patrol a wider zone extending to the high seas where most people drown. Mare Nostrum saved 170,000 lives there. I remember how much Europe helped Poles after martial law was introduced in 1980. Ultimately, we were able to change the political system. Europe needs to help refugees, but it has to do so on the basis of voluntary solidarity.
Thank you, Mrs. Valenciano, for 1 minute.
Ante una de las crisis
in the face of one of the most serious crises after World War II, the Commission response has been very disappointing, and people don't want to realize this, but thousands of human beings are calling at our doors. They're not going to disappear just because we turn the other way. There are going to be many dead at sea, on land, and there will still be millions of them, many of them quite obviously do have the right to asylum, so we are not living up to our legal international commitments. Before or after, for good or for bad, member states will realize that the solution to this human drama is not that the poorest take care of the most desperate. Europe has a legal, political and moral obligation to host at least 1 million refugees. How do you think we can put an end to radicalism and extremism, which has been condemned by Europe?
Mussolini. Thank you, Mrs. Mussolini, for 1 minute. Thank you, President. Finally, Juncker has admitted what we'd been saying for time, namely that Italy has been abandoned, and unfortunately also abandoned have been all the immigrants dead in the Mediterranean, put there by traffickers of human beings. But some extremely good things have been said. The proposals which we were always strongly behind about redistribution of immigrants around Europe, European quotas, compulsory ones, not voluntary ones, that would be real solidarity, for example. Then the change in Dublin, it's to say redistribution of requests for humanitarian protection, that too is a form of solidarity. Then as regards the destruction of the vessels, there's a problem that a colleague raised. Very often these are sort of ghost ships, rather than just boats from Turkey leaving full of immigrants. What are we supposed to do with those vessels? And then lastly, the migrants who are fleeing war for economic reasons, among other things. It's one thing to start from a situation of peace, but if there's profound political change going on in Africa and the Middle East, how are we supposed to be providing humanitarian assistance also for people who are fleeing poverty? So here too we have to have a prudent attitude, because there are too many emergencies for us to face up to at the moment. Thank you very much. Mrs. Sylvie Guillaume for 1 minute.
Albert Einstein said what is crazy is to keep doing the same thing and expect a different result. I mean, this raises a number of questions here. We need effective rescue at sea, search and rescue operations to be set up. We need a proper policy. The budget for Mare Nostrum isn't really of a European scale. How can we talk about a European policy when a number of member states are not participating? And we have a pilot project which is emerging, but we have no specific proposals as to the number of places available. Visas, humanitarian issues, family reunions, these are not addressed. The reason is that the people who are displaced do not have some mechanism. There's no mechanism of solidarity throughout Europe. There's no forecast, there's no provisions for the millions of people. The temporary protection, for example, directive could have been taken into account, and Europe has done nothing to prepare for this influx. It is really impossible to do anything if some of the member states are not willing to pull their weight.
Thank you. Mr. Engel for 1 minute, please.
Thank you very much, President. I believe that a migrant is not a criminal just because he or she leaves her country and has a good reason to do so. The Council, once again, seems disposed to do nothing, and it's right to counter that. We need to open legal channels of migration to Europe. We need more legal immigration, because that's the only way to counter the illegal immigration and people dying because they are migrating under impossible conditions. European solidarity is not sending frontier guards to the Mediterranean. European solidarity is to host, to participate in the hosting activities of migrants, not because they're leaving, not because they want to. They do that because they have to, because their families and their futures are in danger. We cannot continue to pretend that migration is not their problem. The quota system is an absolute necessity now.
Mr. Alfred, 1 minute.
Know what needs to be done. The extraordinary European Council took hesitant steps in this direction. A search and rescue operation that is probably funded and widespread to cover the North African coast. Amendments to the Dublin II Treaty that respect the interests of all European states, big and small. Action against people traffickers. A policy for regular migration to Europe covering asylum seekers and economic migrants. A comprehensive development aid programme for sub-Saharan Africa. However, humanitarian action, vital though it is, can no longer be enough. Recent events constitute a big discontinuity in past scenarios. South of Malta, in 10 days, there were more deaths by drowning than when the Titanic sank. It is no longer just a humanitarian emergency, it is also a security crisis. It has to be dealt with immediately in the interests of all Europeans and all migrants. Police exercises, sporadic or programmed, will not be enough. People trafficking operations have reached industrial proportions. They will be penetrated, perhaps they already are, by extremist elements. The situation in Libya, which has the longest stretch of coastline, is out of control. Waiting for a unified government to form there before decisive action is taken will contribute to further instabilities and deaths. That now means blockading action outside the coasts of North Africa. It would be the best way by which to save lives. Thank you.
À vous la parole.
Mrs. Alliot-Marie.
Il microfono.
Microphone, please.
Oui. Merci, Monsieur le Président. Thank you very much, President. Colleagues, the migration problem is not just a problem from today or the coming months. This is certainly not a problem that is cyclical. This is a true future problem for the years to come. Political crises, a war, desertification of the rural areas, the economic crisis, poor governance, all of this will push more and more men and women to leave their countries, to risk their lives, to try to come and find a better life here. So we should put safeguard systems in place. We should have humanitarian systems in place. We should reinforce Frontex. This is all good, but it's not sufficient. What we need to do is take the bull by the horns and look at the source of the problems. Mr. Francois garnered unanimous applause with his statements here in this chamber. Now, there are certain countries of origin which need aid, and we need to require governance as a compensation for that. And so they need to make sure that they take care of their population. That's what we need to do. We need to address the candidates to migration, and we should make it aware, and I think communication could work well here, make them aware that they are risking their lives, risking the lives of their loved ones. We should let them know that there are mafioso networks that are taking advantage of them. Thank you.
Gomez, per un minuto.
Mrs. Gomes, 1 minute. The European Union has a military mission against piracy in the Indian Ocean, and why can't our navies and our coast guards and our air forces be used to look for people and save their lives in the Mediterranean, and to catch and to bring to court the smugglers and destroy their boats? Why can't we have a common asylum and migration policy with legal methods for immigration, so that the profit from the slave networks can be taken away? Why can't we have early application to member states for asylum? Why are the member states allowed to sell golden visas with residence rights for rich foreigners, whereas the poor who are fleeing oppression and misery don't get anything? Why doesn't the Council ensure that we have a consistent foreign policy, including development policies, helping us to avoid conflicts instead of making them worse, as in Syria, Libya, Ethiopia or Eritrea, abandoning peoples to their fate? When is Europe going to ask the United Nations Security Council for a peace mission helping to save Libya from terrorism and lead it to democracy? Thank you. Mrs. Svitzer for 1 minute.
Nitko ne bi napustio svoj dom da mu je...
Nobody would leave their homes if they felt well there. They are forced to flee because of terrorism and all that is happening in Africa and elsewhere. In the world and in Europe. I am very sensitive to this question because I come from a country with only 4.5 million people. Only 20 years ago we had 550,000 refugees. Many people from Croatia became refugees. Therefore, I understand this strategy. Over 360,000 people died in the Mediterranean. I advocate quota with criteria depending on the economic strength of the country and the population. This would respect the principle of solidarity. It would be a good solution. I think that this is a question of foreign...
Thank you, Mr. Howard.
In this migration debate, when I say we should seek to resolve and prevent conflict wherever it is found, and when my own party leader said in a speech last week of the whole international community that post-conflict planning had failed in Libya, both of these should carry widespread support. But sadly, in the British election campaign, Conservatives chose to wholly falsely characterise this statement as attributing responsibility for deaths of migrants to David Cameron personally, something neither Ed Miliband nor anyone else in the Labour Party ever said. I lament the fact that our opponents seem more worried by the vote count than the body count, because in my country, when all parties come together to sing the Royal Naval hymn, Eternal Father, our lament should be a united one for all at risk. O hear us when we cry to thee, for those in peril on the sea. On migrant deaths, we should all honour those words.
Grazie, onorevole Iot.
Thank you, Mrs. Yotova. 1 minute.
Commissaire, Monsieur le Président du Conseil.
Commissioner, President of the Council, it is time to take action. We're expecting some specific proposals and a common policy. It's not enough just to say that this is a very serious situation in the Mediterranean on the Turkish-Bulgarian border. We don't want ad hoc policies. We want a policy that will be efficient and effective both in the Mediterranean and the border between Turkey and Bulgaria. And we have the eastern borders to protect because of the Ukraine crisis. We want redistribution and displacement quotas. We have to have solidarity, and we have to revise the Dublin regulation. We need some specific action in order to stop the smugglers and traffickers. And we need criminal sanctions. We need a legal means of bringing migrants. We want more help and support for the reception centres. And finally, it's not enough just to save and rescue migrants. We have to look after these people after they have been rescued. They need employment, they need health care, and they need education. Thank you.
Onorevole Kirko.
Thank you. Mr. Kirkos, 1 minute.
Thank you. The Council's decision is not adequate. It only covers some of the essential steps, but we're desperately late. President Juncker talked a little bit further than the 10-point plan. We were expecting a lot more. The Council is dealing with this dramatic problem of rescuing people who are in danger. But nothing is done about what will be done after that. And not to mention the first-line countries who require help and support in their reception centres. So all people who are looking for asylum, applying for asylum, require further support in all countries in the European Union. Unless this is done, we will not be able to fight against this trafficking in human beings. But of course, none of these migrants is really desperate to join the influx. What we need is to revise Dublin, because they would be happy to stay at home if conditions were right. Dublin needs to be revised.
Grazie, onorevole Panzeri.
Thank you, Mr. Panzeri, for 1 minute. Thank you, President. Mr. President in office of the Council, you should know that there are two sorts of leaders. There are people who make history, and we've had some of those in Europe, Altiero Spinelli, Jean Monnet, De Gasperi, Mitterrand, Kohl, Jacques Delors, Olof Palme, just to mention a few. And then there are the people that you seem to represent today, who don't seem to get beyond the political small print. No far-sightedness, no idea of setting the future for their own citizens. People who come to Europe because they're forced to. And I think the recent Council has to be put in this second category. They're afraid of public opinion in individual countries. I can understand that courage is something that either you have it or you can't buy it in the marketplace. But we need a new awareness, we need a new common vision about migration. If you want to be in the class of real European political leaders, then you've got to listen to the European Parliament. Thank you, Mr. Panzeri. I've got a list here with 60 requests for Catch the Eye. Given the time and the long voting session that awaits us, I plan to take some 10 speakers, and I'll give the floor first to Mr. Casa for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think this is a historic moment in our Parliament. If we manage to agree on a resolution that goes beyond, and that is better than what was proposed by the Council a few days ago. We all agree that the policy of pushbacks is unacceptable. We all agree in this Parliament that we need to save all lives that are in danger in the Mediterranean Sea. And we all agree that there needs to be a real solidarity. And in my opinion, a country like mine, Malta, needs to have quotas for all other countries in the European Union. However, we shouldn't be populist. We need to take real decisions that shed a good light on this Parliament, and countries such as Malta and Greece see how to solve the problem at its origin. We can solve the problem at its origin by having a long-term policy. What we are doing today is to solve the problem that we have now. However, we do need a policy that looks ahead and not only immediate solutions. Thank you.
Onorevole Mizzi.
Mrs. Mizzi, 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. With the exception of a number of initiatives taken last week, I feel that the European Union and the Member States have not taken this problem with the seriousness it deserves, because otherwise we would not still be talking about this human tragedy that is probably happening right now while we are speaking. I hope not. It is clear that countries like Malta, Greece and Italy are being affected directly by the immigrants that are arriving by sea, and it is clear that they cannot carry this burden alone. We need concrete and visible and effective action in order to ensure that the burden sharing is shared by everyone. I would like to see a program of solidarity and burden sharing, the revision of the Dublin II rules, better coordination so that the quota of the people who are looking for asylum seekers is shared between everyone. And last but not least, let us address the root of this problem. Why are people escaping, running away from their countries? And I hope that the summit that will be held, the Union Summit, will be concrete and help to find a solution for this human tragedy. Thank you.
Grazie.
Thank you, Mr. Kyrchuk. 1 minute.
Non c'è? Non c'è?
Presidente, se mi permette l'onorevole Kyrchuk.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. Kyrchuk had to go to a meeting, I'm afraid. Can I speak on his behalf, on behalf of ALDE?
Possibile?
No, that's not possible. Mrs. Bilbao.
Onorevole Bilbao.
Mrs. Bilbao.
Prego.
Gracias.
Yes, thank you very much, President. Europe should give a common response to this tragedy. It's an obligation to assist in this emergency, and we need to help thousands of people and give special attention to children because they risk all at sea. They're very desperate. This is the result of botched decolonialism, and so we must centralize the management of asylum requests. We have the capacity together to show solidarity. Our demography and the development that we wish should be realistic and should be tied in with proper migration. We cannot divert these catastrophes. These are people, and these are people who have names.
Mr.
Juaristi, 1 minute. I would have preferred not to have to mention their names today. I would have liked to meet these people in Bilbao or in Rome or in Berlin, but they've drowned in the Mediterranean and somebody has to speak on their behalf. These are our sisters, our sons, our mothers, our nephews. Mohamed Abdelkader, Abraham Sevelli, Almas Solomon,
Khalifa, Daniel Tareke, Danayet Quiros, Denden Emmanouil, Efrem Semere, Filmon Tadese, Gueye Kirani, Semira, muerta junto a su esposa,
who died together with her husband and her 2 daughters,
Mohamed, quien murió junto a su hijo,
who died with her son,
Ibrahim, Nureddin Mohamed, Said y Mahfouz Yunus, Samuel Solomon, Semir Yassin, y así más de 23.
And another 23,000 people since 1992. Thank you. Mrs. Lunacek, 1 minute. Thank you, Mr. President. Ladies and gentlemen, and people on the tribunes. Yesterday we had a commemoration in this house, outside this house, for thousands of women, men and children who have died in recent years trying to find somewhere safe to live here in Europe. A list of thousands of meters of names of thousands of people. I hope that all of you in this house who are still not in favor of a serious search and rescue program on the high seas, who are still not in favor of a fair distribution of refugees to whom we have to open our doors, and those who are still not against what the home ministries and the foreign ministries of Europe are trying to do, not to see those lists. We need a real rescue plan at sea, on the high seas, so that refugees don't drown anymore. We need a fair distribution key, and we need fair relations and more development cooperation. Otherwise, more of these people will drown. We as a European Union cannot allow this to happen anymore. Thank you. Mr. Petir, for 1 minute.
Thank you, President. Last and this year, almost 5,000 deaths in the Mediterranean. We can't be indifferent. We need urgent action. Therefore, we should triple the money for Triton, 120 million euros for saving human lives in the Mediterranean. But this is not enough. 15 million people who are traveling to Europe cannot be solved in a short while. We shouldn't close the door to migration. We shouldn't close our eyes to people in need. Migration is one of the most important European problems and a challenge for the European Union. We have to face it and show solidarity, but we should first of all solve the causes of the problem. We should fight against smugglers who make false promises and then cause the deaths of these people. We should solve the problems at their root so that people needn't flee their homes. They need a home. It is the minimum.
Thank you, Mr.
Anche a lei 1 minuto.
Grazie, Presidente.
Thank you, President. I'm not going to repeat what's already been said basically by all the groups. Of course, we're facing a tragedy of global dimension. I think what we should be thinking about, rather than debating year after year, because this is not the first time that we've been talking about tragedies in the Mediterranean, we end up always unable to take an active decision. I don't think that the Council is really going to be able to face up to this emergency either. What we should be asking ourselves is whether the intergovernmental method that we are still using on something as important as this is adequate, whether it can deal with a disaster, an emergency of these really uncontrollable dimensions. That's what we should be thinking about. We're all very well good at using the community method on trade and money and finance, but when we start talking about human lives, we're passing resolutions and chattering in debate without solving the problem. If the Union is a union, this is the time to show. Thank you. Mr. Shogor. For 1 minute, please.
The recent drowning of more than 1,000 people in the Mediterranean Sea sadly highlights yet again Europe's inability to cope with the unprecedented humanitarian crisis in the world. Refugees fleeing war or persecution are growing as Europe allocates fewer resources for life-saving missions. Letting more people to die at sea does not deter others to attempt sea crossing. As a community of values, Europe should do more, not just in terms of rescue at the sea, but also in preventing. One possible way to achieve the latter is to process asylum requests abroad. However, on the long term, we need a stronger engagement with countries of origin and a better targeted development policy addressing the push factors of terrorist conflicts, poverty, systemic corruption and misrule. Thanks.
Onorevole Giuffrida, prego.
Mrs. Giuffrida, 1 minute, please. Thank you, President. Yet again, we find ourselves here talking about disasters in the Mediterranean. There was an extraordinary council with unsatisfactory results. Now we wait to see the roadmap with times and methods in it of what was decided and what will be decided by the 13th of May. President Juncker said the challenge is not looking just at effects but at causes. But there hasn't been any clear position on revising Dublin. If Italy is not to be left alone trying to handle a problem that's bigger than all of us, then facts will follow words. We're ready here in Europe. People who tell us that we're not prepared to do fingerprinting also tell us that the refugees ought to stay in Italy. But we need to encourage legal methods for this exodus due to geopolitical factors which are unstoppable. We need to have the member states clear which are prepared to work for reinsertion and migration and legal migration. That's the only way to save the migrants.
Signora Avramopoulos, prego.
Commissioner Avramopoulos, please, it's your turn.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Scusi.
Yeah.
I beg your pardon. Order, please. We're concluding an important debate here. I'd urge colleagues, please, not to disturb the speakers. Commissioner, please.
Signor Presidente, honourable members of the Parliament, on behalf of the Commission, I would like to thank you, indeed, for this debate. It was not a very interesting debate. Allow me to qualify it as a historical debate. I want to thank you for your suggestions. There is a momentum to act on migration, and it is our duty. It is the moment to pass from words to actions. We should not only speak about solidarity. Solidarity must stop being a slogan. It has to become a reality. This is not about Fortress Europe protecting the borders. This is about more capacities for search and rescue. So now we need to act quickly. Indeed, as you said, Frontex is taking the necessary steps to incorporate all these proposed assets in the two operations, Triton and Poseidon, as soon as possible. This strong expression of solidarity is an important step forward, but it is true, more needs to be done. It is very important to deal immediately with the crisis. We cannot accept the loss of more lives. We need to do our utmost to save lives. But dealing with migration is not only dealing with a specific crisis of a specific region. As I always said, we need a holistic approach. This is also why migration is one, and it was from the very beginning of the life of this Commission, of the main priorities of President Juncker, as he underlined just some minutes before. The European Commission, as you all know, will present on May 13th the European Agenda on Migration. This agenda will develop the much-needed comprehensive approach for migration.
Commissario, mi perdoni.
Commissioner, excuse me, one moment. Ladies and gentlemen, we are concluding an extremely important debate which began early this morning. We've heard a great many honourable members speak, and I would urge all of those who are on their way in not to interfere with the debate that is in course, that is continuing, and not to be discourteous towards our guests, the Commissioner and the Council representative. Chairman Weber, let me ask all groups to be ordered and properly respectful of this debate. Commissioner, please.
So, I was telling you that the European Commission, as you all know, will present on 13th of May the European Agenda on Migration. This agenda will develop the much-needed comprehensive approach for migration. Yes, we have to work on resettlement and relocation, and to come up with concrete solutions. More is needed. The scope of the agenda will be geographically broad, since other regions also have encountered or may encounter problems in future. The Mediterranean is a priority, but we should not forget, and it was said before, it was mentioned before, the Turkey-Bulgarian borders, the Serbian-Hungarian borders, etc. On smugglers, we have to increase our efforts with our agencies, Europol, Frontex, EASO, EMCA and Eurojust, to gather information on smugglers, the modus operandi, to trace their funds and to assist in their investigation. Also, we have to intensify our efforts to engage with countries of origin and transit. In transit countries, we need to find ways to build the necessary infrastructure where migrants can feel safe and not take dangerous journeys to Europe. Yes, we have to look at Dublin to see whether it works. For me, it's an open issue, and we shall come back on that. Moreover, the agenda will focus on legal migration, and especially the blue card. The debate today, as I said, was very important. What happened in the last few days is a clear sign of solidarity to save lives. We must swiftly implement our decisions and at the same time look at mid-term and long-term solutions. We need to do all this together, both the European Union's institutions and the Member States. The European Agenda on Migration is the next opportunity for action. Let me finish by making a comment, since many of you referred to what happened in Indonesia. Last week, the European Council also discussed the issue of death penalty, referring to the case of the French citizens Sheikh Zatlawi in Indonesia. I want to be clear on that. For the European Union, death penalty is never the answer. Thank you very much for your attention.
Presidente, adesso la parola al Presidente.
Thank you, Commissioner. Now, President Tusk, and I'd urge order in the House.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. The situation in the Mediterranean is deeply dramatic and frustrating for everyone. Everyone, not only in this room, but also leaders in office across Europe, have been touched by this tragedy and level of human suffering involved. Europe did not cause this calamity. It is caused by poverty, war, instability, failing states, and a population boom in Africa. It is, of course, not acceptable that hundreds of people die when trying to cross the sea to Europe. Neither can we open our doors to everyone. That is the dilemma we must deal with in the coming months. We must manage it as best and as humanely as possible. There are longer-term solutions to these problems, such as more targeted development aid, but for now our efforts were focused on saving lives. We are increasing immediately the search and rescue capacity of EU border operations in the Mediterranean. Take a look at where Triton exactly has carried out rescue operations. You will see how close to Libya they have been already. The scope of these missions is going to increase in line with the massive increase in resources. And Frontex will in the next days discuss with the Italian authorities about enlarging the main patrol area. We are going after the smugglers, who are the real culprits, in fact criminals, and we have already sent an important message about our readiness to act. We are getting serious about cooperation with countries of origin and transit, including by inviting the relevant African leaders to a summit in Malta. And we have advanced the difficult debate over resettlement, relocation, and the need to have a better functioning European asylum system. Dear colleagues, according to many interventions, our meeting last week decided too little. Prime Minister Renzi said after the meeting, and I quote, "Europe has shown serious commitment. For the first time, there is a shared strategic approach." And similarly, Joseph Muscat of Malta also said, "There is a new sense of resolve. What happened last week definitely changed the mood in the European Council and in Member States." In this case, I will respect the opinions of the leaders in the countries most affected. Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you very much.
Grazie. Grazie, Presidente.
Thank you, President Tusk. I've received 7 motions for resolution to wind up the debate, which we have devoted this morning to. The debate is now closed. The votes start, and I'll leave the chair to Vice President Tajani.
I'm ready. Cari colleghi,
Ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure to receive our colleague, a member of the Iraqi Parliament, Mrs. Vian Dakhel. No one will ever forget her powerful speech last August in the Iraqi Parliament, in which she called for intervention to save Yazidi women who had been captured by the so-called Islamic State. That will never be forgotten. She's accompanied by a delegation of Iraqi Yazidi compatriots victims of ISIS, Mrs. Digyar Saidjaza, Mrs. Aish Taha Othman,
il signor
Mr. Khurshid Othman Yusuf. We all pay tribute to your courage, and we assure you of our full support for your struggle and for the right of the Yazidi people to live in dignity and freely to practice their faith. Welcome to Strasbourg and welcome to the Chamber of the European Parliament, the Chamber of European Democracy.
Le competenti autorità della Finlandia.
The Finnish authorities have told me that Mr. Hannu Tukala is replacing Mr. Olli Rehn with effect from the 27th of April. I'd like to welcome this new colleague, and pursuant to Rule 3, Paragraph 2, for as long as his credentials have not been verified and no decision on any possible appeal has been decided, Mr. Hannu Tukala will sit with full rights in Parliament and its bodies, provided that he has previously signed the declaration that he holds no function that is incompatible with that of a member of the European Parliament. Welcome to the House, sir. Now we start today's long voting session. And the first vote
You have the floor.
Señor Presidente.
President, I ask you and the Chamber to have the possibility to delay the vote by 2 minutes so that the services of the Chamber can distribute the voting list for our party, which is still not yet available.
Be quiet, please. Posso aspettare un minuto?
I can wait for a moment.